Tonight's hearing will not go beyond 10 p.m. If not concluded, it will be continued to a date and time certain. The hearing may be continued for other reasons as well. If an announcement of an additional hearing date and time is made tonight, it will be the only notice given of that additional hearing. So with that in mind, we are going to move into the Planning and Zoning Division staff report. What am I missing?
Okay. I thought you went through the order of the hearing
I can
before
do
I
that
do my
if you would
staff
like.
report. I don't know. I thought that was
Oh, I think
common.
that is how the script usually runs.
Yes.
So, yeah, I just jumped over that script.
Okay.
Okay. So the public hearing will be conducted as follows. The Planning and Zoning Division staff report, entry into the record of any additional correspondence received, technical information from other government agencies, testimony by the applicant or representative with a maximum length of 45 minutes, testimony by representatives of recognized community planning organizations, hamlets, and villages, testimony by proponents of the application, testimony by the opponents of the application, testimony by persons who are neutral on the application, applicant's rebuttal, which is limited to arguments addressing evidence already in the record, Planning and Zoning Division staff surrebuttal, which is limited to addressing evidence already in the record, closing of the public hearing, and the Planning Commission discussion and action. And so I'll defer, when we get to the public testimony section, I can go through the rest of the discussion about public testimony. So let's just go ahead and jump right into
Okay.
the planning report, staff report.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Hi, I'm Martha Fritzy, a senior planner here with the county's Planning and Zoning Division. I am going to walk through the staff report with you. You should have received a hard copy and an electronic copy. It's pretty sizable. I am going to apologize ahead of time. There's a lot, and it may be a bit of a long presentation, but it's really a lot of information to get through. I will try to do it as efficiently as possible, but I hope you're comfortable. So, before we get started, there's one new exhibit on your table in front of you. It's Exhibit 6. It's the applicant, see, I can't even talk already. I'm on my first slide.
Likewise.
The applicant's comments regarding the staff report. It's really just proposed changes to the conditions of approval. You don't need to necessarily look at it now. We'll get to it a little bit later in the presentation. A couple of things of note. We here in the planning department have not received any comments from the public or agencies. And the community planning organization in this area, the South Canby CPO, is not active. However, it's my understanding that the applicant has had a community meeting to discuss this application. I think they're going to talk a little bit more about that in their presentation. So, as Brian mentioned, this proposal is 3 different file numbers. To summarize, it is a post-acknowledgement comprehensive plan amendment to designate approximately 99 acres of the subject property as a Goal 5 significant mineral and aggregate resource. That's the first file. An associated zone change to apply the mineral and aggregate overlay. And if those are approved, an approval of the district site plan review, an application for the proposed mining operations to actually be allowed to commence. Along with this, the applicant has requested that we modify a condition of approval on a prior land use application on a neighboring property that deals with the hours of operation for the processing plant. And we can talk about that a little bit as we go through this too. So generally, this is the site location. It's a little bit hard to see on this map. It is southwest of the city of Barlow and the city of Canby, northeast of the city of Aurora, about 3/4 of a mile south of the intersection of Highway 99E and South Barlow Road. The entire site consists of 8 tax lots. Those tax lots consist of about 106.5 acres, although only 99-ish of those acres are proposed for the extraction area. The reason being the other 2 areas that are not being proposed for extraction are a pretty significant elevation. There's a pretty significant elevation difference between those parts of the property and this site. It's roughly 60 feet higher. The house sits on one of them, and a rural industrial business sits on the other one that some of you may be familiar with because you did the zone change for that portion of the property. It was Gobi Walnut down on Highway 99E. Here's another picture of the subject site. This is a really good illustration of all of the mining that's been going on in this area. I'm sure we've all driven by it going down Highway 99E past Canby. The purple sites are not owned by Cadman. That's some older mining sites that were Canby sand and gravel. The most recent one that the county approved is sort of the southwesternmost purple site, which was the Traverso site, which was sort of part of Canby sand and gravel, and I believe that site has been sold. I don't know where it is in the process, but you all did approve that under this same Goal 5 approval. So the red hashed areas are the Cadman properties. And it's referred to in the application and will be in the presentation as phases 1 through 4. The area that we're looking to approve today would be phase 4. It's in the southwest corner. It's an expansion of phase 3, which was approved in 2012. The properties to the east of Barlow Road were approved a while back, but they're notable because the processing facility is located on that eastern side. And this may be a little bit hard to see on the monitor, I'm not sure. Phases 1 through 3 are identified here. Where the culvert is identified, there is a conveyor that goes underneath Barlow Road where the materials from the west side that are extracted on the west side of Barlow Road are conveyed under the road to the east side of Barlow Road over to the crushing and screening plant. And so the proposal in front of us today does not include processing. It includes simply the excavation of the area that's identified there as phase 4. This is the proposed mining plan. The area is proposed to be mined out in a series of cells, starting roughly, and I believe I'm correct, at the northwest corner, going west to east in cell 4A, and then the next cell down, and then next cell down 4C, and then 4D is the final one along Barlow Road. And then this is largely contours, but it identifies the conceptual reclamation plan, which is a requirement of these applications. And it shows the areas, most of the property will be a large lake, pond, water feature, and the rest of it left in sort of a natural state. So, moving forward, the relevant policies and criteria that we have to look at when we're considering a mining operation such as this are listed up here. There are a number of them. The bulk of it is found in the administrative rules in OIR 660-23, 180, which walks you through the designation of mineral and aggregate resources as a significant Goal 5 resource. As I mentioned last week when we just talked about Goal 5 resources a little bit, statewide planning Goal 5 is natural resources. There are a number of Goal 5 resources, including riparian corridors, wildlife habitat, scenic rivers, groundwater resources, and mineral and aggregate resources. And to designate a resource as a Goal 5 resource, there's a pretty prescribed series of steps that need to go through, and we're about to walk through them for this. But the criteria and decision-making process are specifically identified in the administrative rules, and that's what we need to follow. And for this particular application, it involves identifying whether or not the resource is significant, whether or not to allow or not allow mining. And if you decide to allow the mining, then it's a comprehensive plan amendment to add this site to our Goal 5 inventory, the zone change to apply the mineral and aggregate overlay. And all of this happens in a series of public hearings, of which this is the first one. You all are tasked with making a recommendation to the Board of County Commissioners, and the Board of County Commissioners will make the final decision. Whoops. So, moving forward. I put a new copy of this in front of you all. It's no different than your old copy except for literally one word because I found a typo. I find this helpful to walk through the process. You can use it if you would like. And we are just going to start walking through the analysis that's involved with this application. So the first step is to determine whether or not there's a complete application. The administrative rule specifically outlines the things that need to be included. They are listed up here. All of those things were included in the application. The final decision on this application, as per state law, needs to be made within 180 days. And so staff has found the application is complete. and the 180-day deadline in this case is March 30th, so we are doing pretty well. Step 2, you need to determine if your site is significant. A site is significant if the quantity, if you're in the Willamette Valley, which we are, is over 2 million tons of aggregate material. There are quality standards. It needs to meet ODOT specifications for base rock, and that's done through testing the material that is extracted out. And identification of an appropriate location, site characteristics, thickness of the aggregate layer, and such characteristics. And if you are on higher value farmland, there is a average thickness that the resource needs to be. In this case, this is not high value farmland. It is primarily class 4 soils, and so there's nothing under state law that says the depth that is required. It would meet the depth that is required if it were high value farmland, but in this case, it doesn't necessarily matter. And so the applicant had a consultant go in and do 18 borings throughout the area and look at the depth of the materials and send it to the testing lab to determine the quality of the materials. Based on the calculations in that report, there are approximately 8.1 million tons of material estimated on the subject site. About 6.9 million of it would be available for excavation between having to have setbacks, and there is a BPA easement and a tower that run through the property. I guess you can mine under the easement, but not under the tower, so there's some setbacks around the BPA tower. But the 6.9 million clearly exceeds the minimum of 2 million. So there's definitely the quantity. Based on the testing that was done, it is of appropriate quality to meet the ODOT specifications for base rock. And the location is a reasonable location. I mean, there's been mining going on in this area for something like 70 or so years. It has easy access for the materials to get out to the state highways. And so based on all the analyses provided in the application and the appendices, staff finds that the subject site can be deemed a significant Goal 5 aggregate resource. So moving on to step 3A, which seems kind of weird, but it corresponds to the numbers in your matrix. If you determine that you have a significant resource, you then need to determine what the impact area is, because you need to look at whether or not you are going to allow mining, and part of that is an analysis of what kind of impacts it would potentially cause. State law says that your impact area doesn't need to be any larger than 1,500 feet from the mining area unless there's some information that you have that indicates it should be larger. In this case, there is no information that would indicate it needs to be larger, so the applicant has designated a 1,500-foot impact area in which to study impacts. So when you're looking at impacts in this area, or potential impacts, you have to look at conflicting uses. And state law is very prescriptive here about what conflicting uses are. You need to identify existing and approved uses within the impact area, and you look specifically, you analyze specifically impacts to sensitive uses, things like dwellings. Our ZDO lists conflicting uses, lists such things as schools and daycares and churches and things like that. Within this area, because it's a rural area, it is largely surrounded by EFU land, exclusive farm use zone land, ag land. A good portion of that to the east, north, and northeast are already mining operations. To the immediate west is a small rural industrial use. South of the property, there's some agriculture going on, primarily corn, hay, nursery stock, trees. And the applicant identified 20 dwellings within that 1,500-foot impact area. The dwellings are scattered on the farmland to the east and south, and then there are a fair number of them on, do I have a pointer? No, oh. And then there's a fair number of them along Highway 99E over here. This the only area that's zoned rural residential. The remainder of the impact area is zoned for zone exclusive farm use, except for this one little rural industrial pocket right here. And so the applicant identified the potential conflicting uses, and then you need to determine whether or not conflicts will happen and whether or not they can be minimized. And the important thing about minimizing a conflict is to understand that if there is some sort of local, state, or federal standard, if you can meet that standard, then your conflict is determined to be minimized. It doesn't mean you don't impact the uses around you at all. It's just as long as you are within the acceptable standards, your conflict is considered minimized. Excuse me. If your conflicts are minimized, you can allow mining. If one or more conflicts are not minimized, it requires you to do an additional analysis. So in this case, I'm sorry, the specific types of conflicts you need to analyze are also listed in the administrative rule. They include noise, dust, other discharges like diesel, groundwater impacts, stormwater impacts. Noise, as you can imagine, is often a big impact potentially for a mining operation. And so the applicant hired a consultant to do a noise study. And in this case, the things that would be making the most noise are the mining equipment, potentially rock crushers, although I don't believe those are on the site, blasting if you were doing any blasting, but that's not proposed for this site. So in this particular case, it's really just the actual extraction equipment that's on the property. And so the noise study was done, and it found that with the recommended mitigation that is in the back of that study, including some noise barriers and berms to dampen the noise to neighboring homes, with that mitigation, that all of the conflicts can indeed be minimized to the sensitive uses. And then dust, often you get dust with a mining operation because of the actual mining, because of rock traffic, because of truck traffic, and the particulars about the mining characteristics. And so I am not an expert on mining. My limited understanding of mining, of surface mining, aggregate mining, is there is wet mining and dry mining. You're either dewatering the site, you're taking the water out and transporting it somewhere else and mining when it's dry, or you are mining in the water with different type of equipment. And so what is proposed for this site is to dewater it to a level of approximately 10 feet below where the existing groundwater level is now, mine it in the wet for the remainder of the mining. That effectively reduces a lot of the dust that would potentially be created. There are other mitigation efforts that are listed in the conditions of approval, such as watering the haul roads and other things like that that can minimize the dust, potential dust impacts also. And so the applicant has found that those can successfully be mitigated and not impact the neighboring residences. And then other discharges, diesel, again, can be mitigated with the conditions of approval that are listed in the application and in the conditions of approval. Groundwater impacts are often a big issue as well. The applicant has hired a hydrogeologist who I believe is here and will be able to talk to you in more detail about his analysis, but the groundwater analysis is found in Exhibit, I want to say B, but it may not be. And what it found is that if this site were to be dry mined, were to be dewatered the entire time it was mined, it may impact, it could impact wells in the surrounding area. And so it is the recommendation of that report that the site only be dewatered for a certain distance and the rest of it be wet mined. And if that is done, which is a condition of approval that's put on there, then that would effectively mitigate the impacts as well. And then stormwater is largely taken care of on site. The applicants can address this probably in more detail, but stormwater is largely regulated through permitting that they would get through the state, and they currently have a permit for stormwater discharge that would, on phase 3, the mining operation immediately north, that would then be transferred to this site. And so additional conflicts that you need to address are any other Goal 5 resources within the impact area. There are none except for the other mineral and aggregate overlay sites. It's pretty safe to say that mining doesn't create significant impacts to other mining operations, particularly in this case because the neighboring mining operation is theirs. And it's and once that is done mining, they will phase down into and come down into this new site. You also need to look at impacts to local roads, impacts to airports, and impacts on agricultural operations. There was a traffic study done, and it did look at impacts to local roads. This is kind of an unusual situation, though, because in this case, the applicant is proposing not to create any new entrances to this site. They're going to use the existing entrance. They are going to use the existing processing site on the east side of Barlow Road. And this is truly a replacement for phase 3, so it's not generating any new trips or any new impacts to the transportation system. So it's a somewhat easy analysis because the phase 3 was allowed to continue those impacts as well. This property is not near an airport. It is a little over a mile from the Aurora Airport, so there's no concern about bird attractants. And then finally, impacts on agricultural operations. I think it's important to note, and the applicant notes, that agriculture and mining have been coexisting in this area for over 70 years, and there don't appear to have been any negative impacts. And so agricultural operations tend to not impact or not be impacted a lot by mining operations because they're not noise, they don't tend to be noise or dust sensitive uses. And so all of the analysis that was included in the application, hopefully it was maybe a little more articulate in my staff report, leads staff to find that all potential impacts, and specifically noise, can be mitigated at all sensitive uses. Although it is important to note that the noise impact area actually does extend across the southern boundary of the extraction area. But the important thing to remember about that is the analysis that's involved here is that you need to mitigate impacts to existing uses, existing sensitive uses, and that with the recommended mitigation can be done. And so because of that, because all conflicts are minimized, the applicant is not required to do an easy analysis at this point. And an easy analysis is an analysis of the economic, social, environmental, and energy impacts. And it's basically a balancing of if you were allowed to, if there were going to be impacts, you would have to balance whether or not it was it would warrant mining, whether or not you would allow them to impact these residences. But in this case, based on all of the analysis, those impacts are minimized, and so you can find that mining should be allowed subject to the listed conditions and the mitigation methods that are found in Section 4 of the staff report. So once you determine if mining is to be allowed, you need to determine what the post-mining use is. A reclamation plan is required. The post-mining use must be consistent with the comprehensive plan and the zoning ordinance. Recall that this property is zoned EFU. Even putting the overlay on it does not change the underlying zoning district. It will remain zoned EFU. Ultimately, reclamation is administered by DOGAMI. And so really our task is to look at the proposed reclamation plan and see if it's reasonable and it includes something that is indeed allowed under our zoning ordinance. Natural areas, ponds, lakes are allowed in the EFU zone, just as natural areas. And so the applicant has stated they'll get all the appropriate and necessary permits and approvals from Dogami regarding their reclamation plan. And then moving on, you have to identify future conflicting uses. And the point of this is to identify any uses that might come into your impact area in the future and determine if there is a need to limit or prohibit them or allow them. And so you need to look at new uses allowed by the underlying zoning districts. Again, this is largely agricultural land, and we are primarily interested in sensitive uses that would potentially be impacted by the mining operation or that would impact the mining operation. And so this is where it gets a little complicated, and I may stumble through this, and hopefully this will make some sense. The staff report proposes the impact area include the DEQ noise impact boundary. And I have a map of that later on in the staff report, because that is the area in which the noise generated by the mining operation does not meet the DEQ standard. And so, remember, it does meet them with the mitigation at all of the residences, but there is a small area south of the mining operation that would still be impacted by the noise. The applicant in Exhibit 6 in front of you has requested that the MAU only include the subject property. And as far as we can tell under state law, in order to address this, they need to do an easy analysis. The applicant has agreed to provide that information to us. I think that with the limited area that would be impacted by noise and the limited amount of uses that could actually realistically go in that area under the current zoning, I don't think it will be a particularly difficult analysis, but it's something that we need to resolve, is that southern boundary. I don't think that it is something that is unresolvable, though. So once you reach your conclusion that you are going to designate a site a significant resource, and you are going to allow mining on the site, you then need to amend a comprehensive plan to carry out this decision. That includes adding the site to the Goal 5 inventory of significant sites, which in our comprehensive plan is a table in Chapter 3. Amend the zoning map to apply the mineral and aggregate overlay once we agree on where the boundary is. And then the implementing measures and conditions need to be clear and objective. And so staff has found that all the criteria can be met to amend the comprehensive plan to include this as an inventory of significant sites. And all of the relevant criteria under the ZDO, Section 1202, which applies to zone changes, have been met to apply the overlay district. And those, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on them. There's basically 4 criteria in the ZDO that you look at with the zone change. One is that the proposal is consistent with your comprehensive plan. However, there has been a LUBA case that has essentially said that the administrative rules in this particular case supersede anything in our comprehensive plan, so you do not need to actually look at the policies in your comprehensive plan. And so that's not relevant. And then the other criteria deal with the traffic study that was done and traffic impacts, and again, it's not generating any new trips, and so there will not be any new traffic impacts on the site. And so finally, once we reach that point, the last step is if the applicant requests to actually begin mining, we need to do the site plan review, and that is part of this application. It's the 3rd application. In this application, you look at whether or not the proposal meets all of the standards and criteria in Section 708 of our Zoning and Development Ordinance. That section lists uses that are allowed within the extraction area. It has specific development standards, including access noise screening, hours of operation, drilling and blasting, things like that. It also requires that we review the reclamation plan, and it has some, it includes the process in which you need to do that. We also need to make sure we're compliant with Section 1006, which deals with water supply, sanitary sewer, surface water, and utilities concurrency. And then Section 1010 signs. In this case, I don't believe any new signs are proposed, and so there's nothing in that section that would apply in this particular application. So in reviewing the proposal, staff has found that all criteria are met to approve the site plan review, including the proposed uses that are allowed under Section 708 for this particular site, as I mentioned. It's extraction, some stockpiling, and some equipment storage. The development standards are met as listed in the conditions of approval, including the hours of operation, noise and dust mitigation, access, haul roads, screening, both visual and noise screening. The reclamation plan and the process meet the criteria. Regarding Section 1006, the sewage disposal is proposed to be porta potties, which are mobile, and that's typically how these have been approved. And surface groundwater and water usage criteria are all met, and as I mentioned, no new signs are proposed. So a quick note on item number 4 that was listed. The 4th item that the applicant is requesting is an amendment to a condition in those 3 planning files listed up there, which is the Phase 1 site on the east side of Barlow Road. The request is to allow for processing on Saturdays. And so originally, there was a condition of approval put on this 1993 approval for Goal 5 significant resource on this site, that processing only occur Monday through Friday. I have read through the findings. The findings specifically state that all of the all of the noise is mitigated appropriately per the DEQ standards. I do not see any specific circumstances or findings-based reasons why it would have to be limited to Monday through Friday. Our ZDO Section 708, which is the MAU, allows for processing on Saturdays, and so I think it's reasonable to amend the conditions that currently restrict the processing to also allow it for Saturday. And just on another note, we did send notice to property owners around that property. It wasn't just the ones that were required to send notice to around the proposed extraction site, because this is a change that would potentially affect them. And we did send notice to properties, owners within 750 feet of that site as well, and have not heard anything. So the applicant, after I submitted the staff report, sent a few comments, things that would potentially change from the staff report recommendations. They did notice a few typos, which of course I will take care of. There was a request to clarify that there will be temporary stockpiling of materials on the subject property. The staff report had indicated, because I couldn't find it anywhere in the application, but it is allowed under the mineral and aggregate overlay, and so I will amend that to state that there will be stockpiling. I'm going to jump down to conditions. There was a request for clarification on several conditions, and those are listed in Exhibit 6. For the large part, they are clarifications. I discussed with the applicant removing a condition of approval on the prior Phase 3 because they're required to have a berm in between what's now Phase 4 and Phase 3, which doesn't logically make sense anymore if they're going to mine through there. That will be taken care of. And then really the only substantive comments and conversations that we had are dealing with the DEQ noise impact area versus the subject property for the mineral and aggregate overlay boundary. As I mentioned, the applicant has mentioned or has indicated that they would provide an easy analysis and findings They are, as my understanding, they are forthcoming, and so we should be able to figure out where that boundary should be. Just so you understand what I'm talking about, the red line on here is what the noise study found is the DEQ noise compliance boundary. And to the north of the subject property, that's all on an existing mining site, which already has a mineral and aggregate overlay on it. To the west, that's really in the right-of-way of Highway 99E, so it's really the little southern portions. And it's not a large amount. It ranges from like roughly 50 feet onto some of the properties to maybe 200 feet onto some of the properties. And there is some question about, well, the applicant would like that to just be reflected on the subject property, and quite frankly, that would be, from a process standpoint, the best outcome, but we need to have the additional analysis before we can make that determination. So staff recommendation in the staff report was approval of all three of these applications. Staff still feels that it is approvable pending the outcome of the easy analysis and the findings related to the southern boundary of the MAU. The staff recommends including the change to the conditions to allow for processing on Saturdays, and it's pretty clear that the site meets all of the requirements to be designated as a significant site in the comprehensive plan. So it's really just a matter of identifying where the mineral and aggregate overlay boundary should be. And that is pretty much it. There's a couple of dates up here of note that are not in your printout. Monday, January 13th is the date we've held for a continued hearing with you if it's needed. And Wednesday, February 5th at 9:30 a.m. is when we have scheduled the land use hearing in front of the Board of County Commissioners, in which we will take your recommendation and any amendments that come forth out of this to them. Oh, got black.
Questions for staff? Go ahead.
Just a clarification. For the MAO boundary, is that condition of approval number 2?
Yes, it is.
Martha, you did bring it up, and what I had flagged it on was page 4 of the executive summary, but it was a more detailed explanation of the LUBA decision that impacts the comp. Reading this, hearing what I've heard, I still don't understand. So can you be maybe in simpler terms, or how does it apply to this, or are things going to change with the comp plan, or anyway, can you dive into that a little bit further?
No, and I'll be honest, the applicant's attorney may be able to explain this better than me.
Okay.
But my understanding, put him on the spot. My understanding is really the implication, it doesn't change anything in our comprehensive plan. What it means is that we as staff don't need to analyze all of the policies in our comprehensive plan as it relates to this application, that if you comply with all of the criteria under state law, then that is sufficient. Then it's understood that you should be in compliant with your comprehensive plan as well.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions for staff? Martha, do you know if they're mining on Saturday now on the existing site?
So phase 3 was, the one immediately north, was approved to mine Monday through Friday and Saturday, but they didn't request a change of the condition of approval for the processing. And so the processing is on the site that's on the east side of Barlow Road. It was an earlier approval.
Okay.
So yes, I believe they are.
Other questions?
One more. What's the normal timing of the Dogame review? Since some of this is conditioned upon that.
I honestly have no idea.
All right.
I do have one more, I have
Go
one
ahead.
question. Is this going to increase the amount of loads per day with this addition of Phase 4
No.
than what they're currently doing right now?
No, it is conditioned the same as Phase 3, where there is a limit, a trip limit, and there is also a limit to the amount of aggregate that can be extracted per year, I want to say. It's in the conditions of approval. This is intended, as I understand, and as the application is written, and as the consultants have studied, it is intended to actually be a replacement for Phase 3 once Phase 3 is mined out.
So in my effort to be efficient, not only did I not inform the videographer that we were starting the meeting, but I did in fact skip a section of the script that was pretty relevant. So I'm going to go through that really quickly and we'll continue on to the meeting. We are going to be moving into public testimony at some point this evening. If you wish to speak, please fill out a testimony form. I know I have one of them in front of me. Please state your name and where you are from when you come to the table. The criteria the Planning Commission must use in making its recommendation is listed in the notice given for the public hearing and was also addressed by the staff's oral report. All testimony, arguments, and evidence must be directed toward these criteria or other criteria in the comprehensive plan or zoning ordinance which the person testifying believes to apply to the decision. Please relate any testimony to the identified criteria. Failure by any participant to raise an issue accompanied by statements or evidence sufficient to afford the decision maker and the parties an opportunity to respond to the issues precludes the an appeal to the Land Use Board of Appeals on that issue. Failure by the applicant to raise a constitutional or other challenge to a proposed condition of approval with sufficient specificity may preclude an action for damages in circuit court. Make sure to raise any issues you have with the applicant at tonight's hearing to protect your right to appeal or challenge the county's final decision on these issues. The county's final decision may be appealed to the Oregon Land Use Board of Appeals. So the really important part was a disclosure. So at this time, I will ask all the members of the Planning Commission to disclose any ex-parte contacts, bias, or conflicts of interest. Please indicate the nature and extent of the ex-parte contact, bias, or conflict of interest, and indicate whether you intend to participate in or abstain from the hearing. Does any member of the, well, first of all, does any commissioner wish to disclose any bias or conflict of interest? Seeing none, does any member of the audience wish to challenge any commissioner's impartiality? There we go. So that was the big piece that I skipped. Thank you for your indulgence. We will go back and the next step is to enter into the record any additional correspondence we've received. I understand that we have not received any correspondence than what you addressed in your staff report. Is that correct? I see a yes. At this point, we will receive any technical information from other government agencies. I don't believe we have any. Getting nods from staff. Testimony by the applicant or the representative. We've finally gotten to you guys. Our hope is to get you a recommendation tonight, so we appreciate your efficiency.
We're happy to reciprocate.
Welcome.
Good evening, Chair Pasco, members of the commission. My name is Steve Viper. As soon as I get close, pick it up, closer.
Oh, there we go.
How about that? You want to pull that close when we get to you. My name's Steve Pfeiffer. I'm a land use lawyer here in Portland, and I am familiar with some of you because I've been here a number of times in the last few years on similar applications. And ordinarily, I would take more than a couple of minutes to go through a description of the Goal 5 review process for aggregate because, as Martha points out, and some of you remember, it is an unusual approach to your role here on the commission. Usually you're applying the comprehensive plan and your zoning ordinance criteria, and for a variety of reasons, which I can go into, they go back to 1996 when the state decided that with 36 counties and 36 separate ordinances and a very different range of criteria from one end to the other, LCDC decided back in 96 to adopt the rule that we're operating under tonight, that Martha provided you the outline of, to provide a uniform set of review criteria that apply equally to every county in the state. So every one of these 36 counties goes through exactly the same process, albeit differently in my experience. Some do it differently than others, slightly, but it's a uniform process. And that's why your code or your plan policies and perhaps even your code fall off the list, because what that process was as a result of LCDC is the administrative rule LCDC adopted that, again, you've been through tonight and you went through a week ago, as I understand, are the exclusive criteria. So your plan just falls away, as does most of the ordinance provisions. But Martha's provided you with a uniquely comprehensive, in my experience, assessment and way to work through this process. You received the workshop, you received the outline, which I reviewed just out of interest, and it's absolutely accurate in my experience. And tonight's description of the process was equally accurate. So with that, I'm going to move on to keep this efficient. And the speakers that you see on your screen beyond me are the speakers who are going to follow me. The first is Andy, who's to my right here and is one of the managers and operators of Phase 3 and the overall Cadman operations at this location, and will also assume that role for Phase 4. So he is somebody who can answer many of the questions you might have about how Phase 3 is operated today and how Phase 4 will be operated and how those two interrelate. Following Andy, Dorian Cooper will come up, who's a consultant project manager who's worked with us on this application. Some of you remember Dorian, who also worked on the Traverso application that was about 1.5 years ago, as well as the Tonquin application, which was about 4.5 years ago. Dorian will go through the quality, quantity, significance analysis and some of the operational pieces as well. The final two speakers are Kerry Stanley on noise, mitigation and impacts, and Doug Less, who's our groundwater expert. And once they're through, all of which we do believe will take 45 minutes at best, we'll come back up, Andy and I will come back up and answer any questions you might have. The only thing I'll leave you with before I turn it over to Andy is my experience is that you should feel free to ask questions as they come up and not as they come to you and you have to write them down and lose them. So feel free to interrupt any one of us in the course of our presentation. There's no better answer than one that's in the moment, and otherwise I think it'll be lost, and that just isn't necessary. So I would be, you should interrupt any one of us, and at the end we'll bring the other experts back up as needed to answer any questions you might have. With regard to the conditions, again, we're supportive of the conditions. The clarifications that you have, I think, are my redlined submittal that I sent to Martha, and they're really more clarification in many ways, but we're happy to answer any questions you have about those as well. With that, Andy?
Hello, good evening. My name is Andy Highland. I'm the operations manager for Cadman Materials aggregates business in the Portland area. And I'm going to give a quick overview of who we are and the project, although Martha did a superb job herself, and some of this is a little bit of a repeat. We've had that. So this is who we are. Cadman Materials is an affiliated brand of Lehigh Hansen. The assets in the Portland area were acquired by Cadman Lehigh in July 2017. And Lehigh Hansen itself is the North American arm of Heidelberg Cement, global materials business. We operate 8 sites in and around the Portland metropolitan area, 4 in southern Washington and 4 in Oregon, one of which is 150 miles to the east at Boardman, Oregon. And on the map, you'll see Canby, the site we're talking about this evening, is the southernmost of those sites. If I zoom in to the Canby area, we have 2 operations in this area. The sand and gravel mine, which we're talking about this evening, that's been operating since 1998, and we employ 20 people on that site today. And that's linked to our ready-mix concrete facility, which is just off Highway 99 on the edge of the downtown area, and that employs 6 people. That's been operating since 1999. And again, I repeat, these assets were acquired from a Mexican company, Cemex, in July of 2017. To summarize the proposal, what we're looking to do is expand our existing operations onto a 104-acre parcel to the south of our current Phase 3 operation. That's on the west side of Barlow Road. As Martha mentioned, we'd like to modify the existing conditions to allow processing on the east side of Barlow Road on Saturdays. And the movement of material between the west and the east of Barlow Road will remain the same by conveyor through a culvert under Barlow Road. The scale of the operation remains consistent. That means truck traffic, again, remains consistent in line with our operations today, and the access points to and from site onto Barlow Road and then onto 99 remain the same. Martha talked a little bit about the reclamation plan, which is conceptual and will be finalized through the Dogami permitting process, but fundamentally that will be left as a lake with some degree of backfilling into the northwest of the area to land level. Again, somewhat repeating this, on the screen in front of you, you see a summary of the mine that will be mined in 3 phases, 4A, 4B, and C, coming from north to south. And in those phases, we will mine from west to east. The last cell, 4D, is effectively taking out the road on the east side of the pit. The accesses will be from that crossing point on Barlow Road, down the side of Barlow Road, and then along conveyor lines, which you can just about see in blue, which border cell 4B. Traffic in the pit will be service vehicles, light pickups, that sort of vehicle. As Martha spoke about, we've conducted lots of technical studies and engaged the necessary experts, a number of whom sitting behind me to my right, and they will speak in a moment on their areas of expertise. The last piece I will mention is we did have a community meeting that was approximately a month ago on the 19th of November at the Barlow Church Hall. We had around about 13 attendees, 3 people from the company, plus Doug Glass, our hydrogeologist, one of the company members being myself. A good level of discussion, a number of points raised, many of which have been mentioned already, particularly around groundwater reclamation, noise, light, dust, how we were going to undertake the mining, etc. So good level of discussion there. And at that point, I'll hand on to Doreen Cooper, who will go through the Goal 5 significance criteria.
Unless you have questions of
Quick
us.
question.
Yeah.
Have you had this land, the approximately 100 acres, and it's just been sitting there, or did you recently acquire it?
It's been acquired over the last 6 or 7 months, some with option agreements, which are outstanding.
I have a question, just more out of curiosity. What's the reclamation plan for the previous sites? So is it just going to only be one lake, or will they all be lakes also?
Like Phase 3, for example?
Yeah. I'm just curious.
I'm not sure I understand the question.
Well,
What's the
we know
Dogami-
how this one's going to end up, but you're already mining these other 2 areas, and so I was just wondering, are all of the areas going to be one big lake when they're done, or some of those areas have other purposes?
It's currently one water body to the north, and if this went through, it'd be one water body to the south.
Okay.
So when you complete Phase 3 and move on to Phase 4, you'll end up with one lake in that area depicted as Phase 4 for the reclamation. It'll mingle with Phase 3, the lake.
Hasn't been defined yet.
And Doreen, you may recall from the operating permit.
So that would be through discussion with Dogami.
Yeah,
Yeah, no, I'm just curious
Reclamation
how
plan.
that,
The short version, I don't think is resolved yet.
It's either 1 or 2 lakes.
Yeah, it's either 1 or 2.
just curious.
I have a question,
Go ahead.
about your overburden. Is it going to stay on the actual site of Phase 4, or is it going to
Yes.
cross Barlow Trail? Is it
No.
going to be moved around?
The overburden, well, it'll be moved around through the mining operation, but it will stay on the west side of the road.
It
Used
will
for-
stay
used-
within the cells that
correct.
you identified.
Correct.
It'll become the berms that Kerry Stanley will talk about, the
Yes.
noise berms.
Okay, yep.
You have what, 10 feet on average?
10 feet's the proposed berm around the site, yes.
And the depth of overburden varies?
Somewhere between 3 and 10 feet on average.
Thank you.
And my question would be, on the reclamation, why lakes versus returning the soil from the berms onto the land and having soil there where you have either grazing land, or I guess I know you're working with Dogami on this, but why lakes versus land?
Well, by the nature of the mining operation, we're taking out material. We're using that material to reclaim the site, but because we've excavated material, there will be a remaining void, which is below the water level.
Just, that's where it ends up?
Correct.
Okay, even if you put some of the berms back, it's still lake?
That's right.
Okay,
That's
just
right.
curious, thank you.
And what's the length of time from, you would estimate, till you get to the point of reclamation?
Well, so we will reclaim as we go, as we mine through. It's probably in the region of 7 to 8 years, based on that resource. We mine roughly a shade under 1 million tons a year, with a resource of around about 7 million tons.
And is that true for phase 3, equivalent about 1 million tons a year?
Yes,
Okay.
correct.
Just curious, your product, is it used in the local area, or where do you have the aggregate? Where is it used?
So our business is based around fixed sites, so businesses that consume aggregates, asphalt, ready-mix. I talked about the ready-mix site in Canby, which is obviously a consumer. We also supply asphalt sites in the local area, one of which is Eagle Elsner, which is basically the other side of Canby Sand and Gravel. That's our core business. And then that's supplemented by general market fills, which is typically around Clackamas County. So yes, the majority of that is consumed in the local area.
So your product is actually adding employment in other areas other than just the miners that you have on
That's
your
correct.
site?
That's correct.
Okay.
Hate to ask, is the county a customer?
I couldn't ask precisely, but I would imagine so, yes.
Other questions?
Thank you.
Move on to your, thank you. Welcome.
Good evening. Scoot up here. Can you hear me okay? Okay. My name is Dorian Cooper. I'm an engineering geologist with Cooper Consulting in Helena, Montana. I've been licensed as engineering geologist here in Oregon since 1990 and also in the state of Washington, and do all my work here in Oregon and Washington. Tonight, I'm going to reiterate a lot of what Martha said, which I really appreciate. So I will try to go briefly through this, but talk about two different aspects of the PAPA application. And that is first the Goal 5 significance criteria for the site, and then touch on some of the potential impacts mining could have on land, I should say uses in the impact area. So, okay. Sorry, I gotta put my glasses. Forward, right. Nope, all right. There we go, thank you. Better keep this in my hand. Okay, so you can see pretty much where the outline of the property is, a little less than 100 acres. And to evaluate Goal 5 criteria, there are three aspects for a significant site. One is the location of the resource, second is the quality of the resource, and the third, of course, is the quantity of the resource. And in this case, for the location, there were 18 borings that were drilled across the site, of which 5 were also installed as monitoring wells. Doug Less will be discussing more about the geology and the groundwater study that he did a little bit later this evening. But what these borings did was to confirm the presence of sand and gravel on the site of roughly ranging from anywhere from 30 to 60 feet across the site as far as the thickness goes. And as been previously mentioned, they're active, high-quality aggregate mine sites, kind of not surrounding but to the north of which Cadman has, as well as the current traversal now, it's Cal Portland site, a little bit to the northeast. So in general, this meets the criteria for significant site with regard to location. The second is the quality of the site, of the aggregate resource. Goal 5 requires that representative samples from a mine site, or I should say from a site, be tested under ODOT specifications for for base rock quality. And in this case, samples were taken from a variety of different of the borings, and they were sent to an ODOT lab, which tested the rock, and it does meet the requirement for base rock. And lastly, of course, is a quantity. Again, Goal 5 requires that 2 million tons be a minimum on a site, and in this case, there's about 8.1 million tons of rock calculated. That approximately 6.9 million of that material can be extracted due to the fact you have setbacks. You're not mining the whole property line to property line.
Do they have a density requirement for that? The 2 million tons, is there a minimum area for the 2 million tons or just
No.
any area?
Any area, and this is in the Willamette Valley. Outside the Willamette Valley, there's a different requirement for volume. So in this case, the site basically meets the significance criteria for location, quality, and quantity, and should be put on your mineral and aggregate resource inventory. The second little area, I'm going to talk about is any potential off-site impacts as a result of mining. And as you can see in this photo, the red line, of course, is the outline of the property itself. And Goal 5 requires, as Martha said, that the applicant has to look out 1,500 feet, and it's basically a donut circle around the property, basically a donut, and look at what approved land uses there are within that donut, and then look at the potential, if there are potential impacts to those land uses as a result of mining. So as you can see to the north of the site, you can see where the Cadman Phase 3 mining is taking place. To the east, you can see there was mining, and now there's also the processing facility, which is considered Phase 1 and 2 of Cadman. When you go to the south of the property, you're climbing, I don't know if anybody's driven up there, but you climb about 60 feet in elevation higher. And that's where some agricultural uses are, as well as scattered residences. And again, to the west, you have some agricultural uses, and Highway 99E, which runs through a portion of that. So impacts, noise, I'm going to defer to Kerry Stanley. He'll be speaking in a moment. As far as conflicts, dust, which Martha mentioned as well, ground disturbance will cause dust, stockpiling, kind of the typical mining uses, your aggregate extraction and reclamation activities. However, they're going to be mining pretty much in the wet, underwater basically, groundwater, going to be digging in the water, and so very little, if any, dust would be a result of the wet aggregate being extracted. They're going to be conveying the aggregate material that's being mined from Phase 4 over to Phase 1 for processing, which is currently being done from Phase 3 to Phase 4, and those conveyors will be covered, so that reduces dust potential. They'll be watering the roads as necessary in the drier times of the year on the Phase 4, as well as seeding and grass-type seeding on the overburden berms that will be constructed. Traffic, as Andy already pointed out, is basically staying the same. No different impacts. The volume of traffic will be the same, as will their access. With wetlands, there are no wetlands that, within the mining area or the impact area as identified, or not identified, there aren't any, on the National Wetlands Inventory map, which the county has to take a look at to see if there are any mapped. Archaeology, sometimes from ground disturbance activities, you might run into artifacts. So there is what's called an inadvertent discovery plan that will be put in place prior to any ground disturbance out there. And basically that requires if during the mining operation, any artifacts are discovered, all work has to completely stop in that area, and basically archaeologists will have to come out and take a look and examine it. Sometimes SHPO, which is the State Historic Preservation Office, will send folks out to evaluate if it's a concern or not.
Do your employees get trained in identification of what to look for as they're mining?
The mining employees?
Yeah.
I didn't hear what you said, sorry.
Do the mining employees have any training for identification of if any of archaeological resources are discovered?
I'm not with the mining company, but, I mean, obviously, if you see things, and, because there has been, not on this site, but I'm aware of other sites where even dinosaur bones or bones of something has been discovered, and a lot of times there's protocols. In this case, because this is also a recommended condition of approval that this inadvertent discovery plan is even in place before they start turning any dirt out there, that I imagine, and I can ask the company representative to explain anything further, but I can imagine that typically you're trained somewhat, just like with safety, you're also trained to watch for if something comes up out of the blue, to at least let their senior folks know that. So I'm probably not answering the question well. I do not work for that company, for Cabinet.
Follow up?
Yeah, thank you. Groundwater, Doug Gus will be responding to. And last is stormwater, and that's again from ground disturbance. A lot of times stormwater will be infiltrating back into the ground, but at the same time in Phase 3 and tentatively in Phase 4, they will convey any stormwater over to Phase 1, which is a processing area. There are stormwater ponds there, and they have permits to then discharge that water out into the Malala River. These permits are issued by Department of DEQ. And so with that, I will answer any other questions if I can, or I'll turn it over to Carrie Stanley.
I do have one question.
Sure.
Do you have your local watershed council involved with the, as you're dispelling this water into the Malala River?
Well,
Or it's Malala River that's closest, right?
correct.
Okay.
It's the State Department of Environmental Quality, and they are the ones that actually issue a permit. So the company, Cadman, currently has permits. They have a stormwater plan design that's in place right now, how they collect the water, how they store it, obviously, into the stormwater ponds, and then over time they release it into the river. There is huge protocols as to the permit itself, the DEQ permit itself, and how often they have to, after rain, certain amount of rain, they have to sample the water before it goes off-site to make sure turbid water is not going off and so forth. So it's quite a permitting process. I don't know if DEQ, because that's who the company gets a permit from, I don't know who all if they send information, I know they do to the county, but I don't know if they circulate to certain watershed councils, to be honest.
I'd just be curious on temp, turbidity, dissolved oxygen content prior to entering the river.
Right, and that, all of those, and there's a lot of parameters the DEQ has that the company has to follow. They have people inside that test all the time and check. Also, DEQ is changing and updating right now their rules for stormwater and for discharging water, and so that is only going to get stricter.
I had a question, it may not be for you. Is Phase 3 going to be finishing up and slowing down to basically stopping, and then as Phase 4 amps up?
Yeah, my understanding too is that Phase 3 will first be mined out, and then they'll move in southerly into Phase 4. Yes.
Okay. No overlap?
No,
Okay.
I'm aware of.
I have a question.
Sure.
You stated there were 18 borings?
Borings,
Okay. And there were what, 4 or 5 monitoring wells?
yes.
What are you monitoring?
Oh, I'm sorry, they're groundwater. It's to monitor for a baseline to understand the water quality. So there's certain tests that are taken to understand what the water quality is out there right now before any mining takes place. And also what depth the water is at this point in time. So they can, number one, plan plan their mining operation around how much they're going to dewater, which Doug Gless will discuss more. But also over time, as they start mining, they want to be able, they continuously are monitoring their water, especially the water levels, to make sure they're not showing any impacts off-site. So if you don't see impacts on your property where your wells are, you're not going to have impacts off-site. They're also planning to add an additional 4 monitoring wells. So there'll be a total of about 9 across the property that they'll be monitoring through the life of the mine. And as the mining moves, some you're going to be mining through and disappearing. Some of those wells will disappear. So over time, as you move across, some of those wells will disappear, but there are other wells too.
And so phase 3 has had the monitoring wells.
They have monitoring wells as well.
And
yes.
those have obviously been satisfactory. then.
Yes, and they've sent, the state, DOGAMI requires every so often well reports as to, from the monitoring standpoint. Okay.
Thank you, Carrie. Doug?
Good evening. My name is Kerry Stanley. I'm a registered acoustical engineer in Oregon, and I did the noise study for ABD Engineering and Design. And here tonight to just talk to you about that. First, I want to just give you a little background. In 2011, Daly Stanley and Associates conducted a noise study for the Canby Pit Barlow Road aggregate mine phase 3 expansion area, and that was approved by Clackamas County. In 2019, Cadman decided to seek permission to extend that excavation operations into the area known as phase 4, directly south of phase 3. And ABD Engineering and Design, which was a merger of my previous firm of Daly Stanley and Associates and Acoustics by Design, we conducted a noise study of the phase 4 mining plan to determine steps that should be taken to assure sound levels that all existing and approved noise-sensitive land uses would be in compliance with the DEQ noise standards, which, as you heard, if you're in compliance with the DEQ standards, any noise impacts are mitigated. I just wanted to briefly go over what the criteria is. When a mine site expands into contiguous property, the criteria that applies to the mining equipment operating in the original area basically applies to that equipment operating in the expansion area. In the phase 3 area, noise radiating from the mine equipment was regulated by the DEQ maximum allowable noise standard, and that standard is shown there in the table. And it's written in terms of the hourly L50, L10, and L1 noise levels, which are defined as the levels equal or exceeded 50%, 10%, and 1% of an hour respectively. And you can see the numbers there for daytime between 7 a.m. and 10 p.m. Those values, the L50 cannot exceed 55, the L10 60, and the L1 75 dBA. At nighttime, it's 5 dB lower. Except for the L1, it's actually 15 dB lower for that particular criteria. The proposed mining operation is for overburden material to be removed from areas of the site and used to build security berms and noise control berms where needed around the site. And I just wanted to point out the security berms, we're told that they're going to be about 10 feet. So they will have a 10-foot berm around the site. And in some cases, those will be adequate for noise. In some cases, they won't. They won't be adequate, and we'll have to increase them. And I'll go over that with you in a bit. But the aggregate materials will be excavated from 4 areas, as you've already heard, cells 4A, B, C, and D. And as you also have already heard, but I'm going to go ahead and say it again, the operation will begin in the northwest corner on the western edge of cell 4A and move west to east through a series of subcells. And then cells 4B and C will be excavated sequentially following 4A, basically starting again from the west side and moving east through those 2 cells. And then 4D would be excavated from the south of the site toward the north to basically back out of the site. Each subcell within a cell will be excavated down to its final depth 35 to 60 foot below the existing grade before excavation operations move into an adjacent subcell. And I'll just kind of go over that with you in just a moment, but I just want to give you the rest of this. Because the resource thickness differs across the site, there are two different excavation techniques expected to be used at the site. In the western half, the resource material is 15 to 30 feet thick, so the material will be removed in what's called a single lift using a wet mining approach. On the eastern half of the site, the resource is a bit thicker, and they're expecting to have two lifts because the excavator can't reach down quite that deep with one lift. So they'll have a dry lift and then a wet lift as a second. And in the dry mining, the excavator will begin on the north side of the subcell and operate moving south, with the bucket being used to pull material down. So the excavator will actually be down on the floor of the dry mine area. And then in a wet mining area, the excavator will be on the surface of the resource and be pulling the material up from the wet area, and it will be moving in a backwards direction. So just wanted to, if you can turn around, I can just demonstrate to you. Here's the subcell 1. All of that material in there will be excavated down to its final elevation before it moves into this subcell. And then the material from the overburden from this, if it hasn't been totally been used to make the berms around the site, will be pushed into this area. And it'll be, again, this will be excavated down to its final depth before it moves into this. So that process will continue across, and then they will come back to the west side and do the same process across, and then this final excavation from south to north.
Will those berms be completed before the mining occurs, or in what order will that happen?
Well, that's we're going to discuss that. The noise analysis or overview here is the loudest hourly statistical noise levels that could ever radiate from the mining site were predicted at residences in the vicinity of the site. The residents chosen were considered representative of residences with the greatest potential of receiving levels that could exceed the DEQ criteria. And then the loudest predicted hour noise levels at residences were compared to the DEQ noise regulation limits. The noise mitigation measures were then identified to minimize the noise as required by Goal 5 rule. And the noise level predictions were made to determine the DEQ noise compliance boundary, which is defined as the boundary separating the area outside of which compliance will be achieved. Inside, you would not have compliance because the levels will exceed the limits. These are the residences that we studied. As you see, they're ringing mostly on the west and south side. There's one up at the north there, and then one to the east, directly east there. But the majority of them are to the west and to the south. The model assumptions that we use, the rock crushing and screening plant will operate continuously where currently allowed. Overburden across the site is approximately 10 feet deep, so the top of the resource is approximately 10 foot below the existing grade. In other words, that's where actual excavator will be at that level. For the excavator, the mining area is assumed to be an acoustically hard surface with a ground factor of 0 because of the water. Water is totally reflective. Sound does not penetrate into water. Sound will travel better in water, but you have to have the source underwater before it travels. For front-end loaders and conveyors operating in the Phase 4 area, a ground factor of 0.5 is used in the analysis because the equipment will be located on acoustically mixed ground, in other words, undisturbed and some disturbed. The effects of atmospheric absorption, topography, and relative humidity and temperature are assumed to be best for sound propagation. The noise model assumes downwind propagation for all calculations. The results of the calculations for the as proposed conditions are shown here in this table, and all of the ones that are shown in red on the right, on the total there, those exceed the DEQ limit. So we looked at developing mitigation to address those residences, and now we get to your question about the berms. If you can turn around, I can show you, we have identified berms in different heights by color over here and on this legend. You've got a 20-foot berm, for instance, on this first northwest corner. You have a 10-foot berm across here, across the south areas, and on the west or the east side. And I told you they were going to be building 10-foot security berms all the way around to start with. When they start this area, the mining, that berm or a combination of berm and barrier will have to be at least 20 foot high. So they may decide to construct a 20-foot berm there. They may decide to do a 15-foot and a 5-foot barrier, some combination there. That hasn't been totally decided at this point. The same with this corner here. This is the biggest, you can see, 35 foot. We expect that we're going to be actually using a combination of maybe a 20-foot berm with a 15-foot barrier on top. And the barrier could be anything from a wooden structure. We've also been talking about the idea of using curtains, hanging curtains. And the reason for that would be so that, because what we found is that you don't need to put that 35-foot high barrier at all times of the mining. It would only be required once the equipment approaches a certain point. Once it's past that point, the curtain or the barrier could come down. So we're proposing to consider something that's more flexible, something that would allow to go up when they need it and come back down when they don't need it. But it would be all built on a base berm of some height, and that height hasn't been decided yet.
What about your backup alarms? Now, are these going to be going off constantly, I would imagine, with back and forth movement of your equipment?
Correct. Those are exempt from the DEQ regulation. However, they have started changing over from the pure tone beeper to more of a broadband sound, which is less irritable. It has more of a, I don't try and make the sound, but more of a rather than the so that's my attempt to doing backup. This then is how we got to the compliance boundary. After we put in the mitigation that I showed you there and assumed those mitigations were in place at the right times, we came up with this is the boundary that it results in terms of, and it won't be, let me just make sure that you understand, this is not what the sound does at all times. As the equipment moves, this boundary moves. This is just the outline of the maximum it will ever extend around the property. As your equipment is moving, like I said, the range of that DEQ contour moves. So with that, I'll let you ask me any questions you might have. And if not, I'll have your water expert come to you.
So these are estimates that you've come up with based upon previous experience, I take it, from other sites?
No. These are calculations based on reference sound levels taken from the equipment that actually is going to be used. And we put that into a model, a sound prediction model. And in this case, we use what's called Sound Plan. It's a model that uses all the international standards in terms of sound propagation methods to calculate using sound propagation. And the reference level goes into for each piece of equipment, and then we predict the sound radiating from that equipment and then sum them all up. So it's including the excavator, the front end loaders, actually we measure the levels of the conveyor, because there are sources associated with the conveyor, such as the drop points where one conveyor transfers to another conveyor. There are steel boxes that the rock falls into before it hits the belt. And then there's the hopper in which the loader drops in material to it, and then that feeds the conveyor. So we took sound measurements from all of that. In fact, there was some mitigation of some of that of the hoppers and the conveyor boxes as a result of the data we measured, because we said we need to mitigate this before we even move it. So they did. That has been done.
So if you're using this model, you said you went out to those separate residences, or what was the purpose of that?
No, we did not go out to them. We predicted the sound levels at those residences.
Based on distance from the site, or?
Correct. A grid was formed across the site, and we identified basically this grid. We put all the sources at each one of those points, and that's the nice thing about the program. It's computer generated. You can model sources located at different points along the site so quickly, which used to have to do by hand. So it saves a lot of time. So that's where the calculations come from, assuming the sources are at each one of these sites at different points in time.
Do you have a plan in place that should operations begin and say there was a complaint from one of those residences, and then do you have a way of actually checking the real live decibel level and then, changing from there? Mitigating it. In other words, the computer model was wrong.
Right. I've never found it to be wrong in 40 years, so that's anyway. I've always overpredicted usually, but to answer your question, if you as and I guess the Board of County Commissioners would do this, they would adopt conditions. If there were conditions that required measurements be made, we would do those.
Okay. And also,
and if there were, you would have to. Well, I've had this in the past where if it's known that someone's going to be complaining all the time, there might be some restriction on how often they can be responded to. If you go out and you find that it's in compliance, if they call the next day, do you go again, or that kind of a thing.
right. And you mentioned also that at this point you have not determined the actual height of your berms.
Oh no, we have determined the height of the barrier that's
right,
required.
The berms, and you said there could be a berm and then a barrier on top of the
Right.
berm. At what point are you going to finalize those?
I would leave that to Cadman to answer that.
Okay.
I'm just curious if the elevation gain on the southeast side of the property, how does that affect sound travel?
Be a little more specific about how it affects.
So the properties to the southeast, right, are higher in elevation by?
Correct. Well, along the south
Yeah, I was just.
and the
probably
southwest.
may not be relevant. I'm just kind of curious if that elevation change affects sound travel to those properties or not, or what kind of.
It does.
Yeah.
Yes. There's reduced ground attenuation to those residences.
Right. So in theory, the sound is increased because of the elevation, or decreased?
It would, if they were at the same elevation, it would be lower because of ground attenuation. By having that
Right.
overlooking,
More of a
there's
straight
less
shot to
ground
the sound
attenuation, so
source.
the level is going to be higher up there than it is down lower. Correct.
Do you know if there's any hydraulic or pneumatic hammering in the process of the excavation to break up rock?
I know there's not.
There's none. Strictly shovel.
It's strictly excavator loading into a truck and hauling away.
That's why they like it.
Any other questions?
I don't think so.
All right, I'm
Thank you
going
very much, Gary.
to turn you over to the water.
Welcome.
Hello, Commissioners. Thank you for hearing us tonight. My name is Doug Gless. I am the president of H.G. Schlicker and Associates, Inc. We are located in Oregon City, Oregon at 607 Main Street, Suite 200. I am a registered professional geologist, a licensed hydrogeologist in Washington. They don't have separate licensing here in Oregon for it, and a certified engineering geologist. And I'm going to discuss the groundwater with you tonight. And I hope I'm pressing the right button here. Hey, got it. So we did a technical study to figure out what's going on out there and what we need to do to make this mine work. We did 18 borings, which is a lot of borings, more than we would typically do. We installed 5 monitor wells. We did analysis of pump test results of those monitor wells to determine the aquifer characteristics. We measured the groundwater levels in the monitor wells and nearby wells, meaning previous monitor wells. We assessed the potential impacts to nearby groundwater wells. We reviewed private and published reports on the geology and hydrogeology of the area, reviewed topographic maps, LiDAR, and aerial photographs.
And how deep are your monitor wells?
Some of them go as deep as, I believe, 70 feet. So here's the site again. I won't dwell on this, but this shows it pretty well. You can see how it kind of curves around that ridge. It's at the south end of the project there. 98.5 acres, as you've been told. Generally flat. Not much elevation change out there. Surface water, Malala River is located approximately 7/10 of a mile to the east. Pudding River is located about 6/10 of a mile to the west. The Malala and the Pudding Rivers intersect approximately 3 miles north of the site, and they flow into the Willamette River approximately 4 miles north. And you can see the site there. The geology is mapped as quaternary alluvium, unconsolidated sand, gravel, and cobbles interbedded with some silt and clay. That is underlain by Pliocene Troutdale Formation, which consists of indurated, that is harder beds and lenses of well-sorted sandstone conglomerate with siltstone and claystone interbeds. Higher elevations immediately south have been mapped as, that's that terrace that lies about 60 feet higher. That's been mapped as Pleistocene alluvium, consisting of gravel, sand, and silt. That was mapped by my partner, Herb Schlicker, first registered geologist in the state of Oregon, and also by Piper, as well as others since then. Subsurface conditions evaluated by reviewing boring logs of nearby wells, monitoring wells at and near the site, and our exploratory borings. We did those 18 exploratory borings from October 16th to October 28th. We pretty much worked our butts off during that time period. It's a lot of holes to get in the ground over a short amount of time. The 18 exploratory borings at the site generally encountered organic topsoil from the surface to depths of approximately 1 to 4 feet. Brown to gray silty clay, clayey silt to depths of approximately 5 to 10 feet. Interbedded sand and gravel with a silty matrix to depths of approximately 70 feet below the ground surface in the eastern portion of the site, and 40 to 45 feet in the western portion of the site. Generally, the gravel averages about 40 feet thick throughout the site. Underlain by dense brown to blue-gray silty clay. And if you keep drilling down, you hit gravels again, because you're in the Troutdale, which is very common to find gravels. You see them as you're driving up the highway out up the Clackamas River there. 5 monitoring wells installed at the site. We measured those monitoring wells right after they were installed on October 24th of 2018. You can see its groundwater elevation there on the very right-hand column. And you'll notice the key thing to notice here is that at the date of drilling and a year later, the groundwater elevations are about the same. And for the most part, they're about 10 feet below the surface. So you're about 90-foot elevation. There's some variation, but generally that's about what it is. You can see that in the winter, which is that middle reading in each of the various monitor wells there, that 117 reading, that the groundwater is a little bit higher because it's been raining and people aren't irrigating as much.
And you don't take measurements in the summer?
We do, but we haven't taken a bunch of, we have a lot of other measurements, and I believe some of those are in the report. So Yeah, yeah, we definitely do. And we have continuous monitoring being done on some of those, where we have a recorder in the wells, and then we go out periodically and download that. So we just to make sure we're getting all the data. When we were installing the monitoring wells, we did a pump test on those to determine some aquifer characteristics, and by that mainly what I'm talking about is how readily does water flow through the material. And if you look on the right-hand side, you have of that, look that right-hand column, K is hydraulic conductivity, which you might think of as permeability. And the main way that it relates to groundwater wells and mining is that high hydraulic conductivity allows rapid recharge of water. So what you've got there is 867 gallons per day per square foot. That's very high. 88 was one of the lower ones. There's more variation than this in the aquifer. This just happens to be the 3 good data points that we got here based on the work we've done elsewhere in phase 3. You can have, and across the street at other sites, you can have it up in the thousands. So it's a good aquifer.
It looks like monitoring well number 4 has poor data across the board.
Yeah, monitoring well number 4, we could not interpret that data, and that's not uncommon. Pump tests in monitoring wells aren't the greatest tests in the world because it's a very small well. It's only a couple inches in diameter, and we can't get a big pump in it, so we can't stress the heck out of the aquifer. So,
How does,
But-
I'm sorry.
go ahead.
I was just gonna, how does hydraulic conductivity impact mining operations in the real world?
Well, it impacts the amount of drawdown that you see adjacent to the mine site. Because you have high hydraulic conductivity, you get rapid feed back to the edge of the mine. So it keeps the water levels higher. If you had, say, a silty sand out there or a clay sand, then you would notice much lower hydraulic conductivity and what we call the cone of depression. That is this from the bottom of the pit floor coming up from it, you would notice that it would stretch out much further and drop further down. So the high hydraulic conductivity is a good thing for us.
And so, I'm sorry to ask,
go
I assume that because of the high conductivity, you're gonna have more water in your pit, which is gonna require pumping out more?
That's
Is
true.
that correct?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, so but the pumping, you need to understand is that when we're developing the mine, we're pumping down, and as you're really pushing it down, you are pumping a fair amount of water.
Right.
But as you're maintaining a level, you're not pumping much
yeah, okay,
because you've established the groundwater surface.
thank you.
We reviewed published geologic literature and well logs for nearby domestic irrigation and monitoring wells, and they indicate that the regional groundwater flows to the north. So it's flowing from south, all those areas. It's not so much coming out of the terrace so much, it's as underneath that 60-foot high terrace. Regional groundwater levels have been declining over the decades. This is the total precipitation. We just wanted to put that up there to show you that it varies. And you can see that this last water year, the 2019, and the prior, 2018, which are way over on the right-hand side of the chart, not very good, and back to back. So groundwater levels out there are relatively low. And we've had a relatively dry fall, as you've probably noticed. Water level monitoring has been ongoing at Phase 3 since 2010, and the effects from fully dewatering Phase 3 on groundwater levels are evident in this data. So what this drawing is showing you is, if you look at the box at the bottom, you'll have some colored charts there, and it's showing you various dates, and it's showing you where the mine is, and it's showing you the amount of drawdown. Can I get this thing? There we go. So there's the box, that's the legend. You can see that, boy, my hand's not very steady. You can see that we really drew it down at this point to do the mining. And that color corresponds to this over here, which is these two wells. This is not the mined area. This is phase 4. This is phase 3. And you'll notice the difference in the drawdown. Rapid and sharp here, and not nearly as rapid or sharp over here. And the reason for that is that you're getting groundwater flow from the south coming in. And here, you've got a mine, so you're not getting any groundwater flow coming into this area up in here, because you got a mine right here. So it's having to come in from the sides. So as you move further away from the mine face itself, you get back up to where the influence of the mine becomes less and less and less. The observed effects of fully dewatering phase 3. Greatest reduction of groundwater level within approximately 500 feet, which is what I was just showing you there. Where was that? Which is, again, right there. Limited effects from fully dewatering beyond 500 feet. Proposed mitigation for phase 4. Limit dewatering to approximately 20 feet below the ground surface. Now, right now, the groundwater is about 10 feet below the ground surface. So we're saying all you can do is skim off 10 feet. Our concern is that if we were to dewater to 30 or 40 feet, like we've done at times for phase 3, we would affect some nearby wells at the south end of the project. And that's something we don't want to do. We're also going to, we're going to limit the dewatering to a 20-foot depth. We're going to continuously monitor groundwater levels. That's absolutely crucial. And based upon what we find in those monitoring wells and those groundwater levels, we will modify the mining plan to mitigate potential effects if adverse trends are not observed. So if we see that we're getting this kind of drawdown way out south of phase 4, or in phase 4, then hey, we've got to make a change to the plan.
Is there an established trend of, okay, now it's hit adverse impacts and we have to change course? Is there something established to determine that point?
Is there like a criteria that we're
Yeah.
trying to meet? Yeah. We believe that at the wells, for example, Weyerhaeuser has an irrigation well south of us. We believe that based on the information we have now, that we wouldn't lower their well more than 5 feet. And again, groundwater hydraulics varies dramatically. So it's really important that we monitor, because it may only be 6 inches or it could be more than 5. And so that's the purpose. By monitoring as we mine, and we're mining from north to south, we can follow that groundwater trend.
I'm curious, when you say limit it to 20 feet below the original ground surface or 20 feet below the ground surface at whatever point you are in mining?
Below the original ground surface.
Okay, so which means that at some point, you're mining in 30 feet of potential water?
Yeah.
Okay.
So that's called a long stick.
Yeah.
An excavator with a long stick.
Yeah.
And it really is.
Douglas?
They're not cheap.
Yeah, okay, well, I know
Do you monitor any of the wells not on the site, any private like Weyerhaeuser's or no ones?
We do not monitor other people's wells, and there's a couple reasons for that. One, most wells, this really applies to domestic wells. Most wells have iron bacteria in the on the casing, and if we run our implements down those wells, we can knock that iron bacteria off, and they'll get discolored water for a while. And then we also would have to shock treat it afterwards, and so they got to deal with drinking bleach that they're not used to.
And so what would happen if you received a phone call from a neighbor who said, my well just dried up? I mean,
Well,
what
in
would
that
be
case,
the
we have-
next phase?
Yeah, we need to go check on it.
Then
and-
you would get involved and,
And then it's worth taking the risk of putting an instrument down the well and see what's going on. Monitoring and mitigation of potential effects of groundwater. We're going to have 5 monitoring wells are currently installed, and we're proposing 4 additional wells. If you notice, the red are the 5 existing, and these blue are the 4 additional that we propose. Possible modifications to the mine plan if potentially detrimental effects of the monitoring wells are observed. 1, establishment of an infiltration trench recharge area directly between the mining activity and the nearby domestic and irrigation wells. So we've proposed that we could put a infiltration trench all along the south edge of the mine. That would be a trench about, say, 20 feet deep. And rather than having the water only at 10 feet down, you would fill it more than that. And so you'd be pushing water into the aquifer. And so you'd create a groundwater mound that pushes water back towards the southern wells.
Where would you get that water?
We'd get it out of the mine. Yeah, we infiltrate, as we're mining, we infiltrate that water on the other side of Barlow Road in ponds that are over there. It's not just being wasted away somewhere. We're trying to push it back into the ground.
Is the water only being monitored for level or for possible contaminants?
Contaminants also, but the contaminants is not on a continuous basis. That's a quarterly monitoring, and that's all explained in more detail in the report. But yeah, we not monitor it first to get a baseline, because we don't want to be blamed for somebody else's contaminants. And then we monitor it as we do our work. Because we don't want anybody drinking contaminated water. We can also alter the mining cell order and or the size of the mining cells. This could help us out. And we can, of course, reduce the dewatering depths. So, in conclusion, mining should progress from the north to the south. That's what's going to allow us to really get a good handle on what's happening in these wells as we move forward in the mining. Mine cells should be primarily wet mined to minimize lowering of the groundwater surface. That's why we're restricting our work to just skimming off 10 feet of the surface water, or the groundwater surface. Dewatering the mine cells should be restricted to approximately 20 feet below the ground surface. Groundwater levels, that's 10 feet below the groundwater table as it exists. Groundwater levels should be frequently monitored to identify potential impacts to surrounding wells. A number of these wells will have continuous monitoring. If a trend is observed that could significantly affect nearby wells, strategies could include, this is kind of a repeat, but establishment of a recharge area, so the recharge activity is directly between the mining activity and the domestic and irrigation wells, altering mining cell order and or the size of the mining cells, reducing dewatering depths.
So what would be the trend and what would make it significant for the impacts?
So when we're starting at the north end and we have these monitoring wells in, what we can do is we can look at it, the closest one to the mine, and we can look at the next furthest one away and the next furthest one away, and we can say, oh, the closest one to the mine is 30 feet down. The next one, which is 400 feet away, is 10 feet down. The next one is 5 feet down. And that'll give us a trend. It'll help us establish what the curve is on the drawdown curve. And if it looks like it's going to significantly affect any well, we would then act. What is significant? Yeah. Significant varies by well, unfortunately. If somebody has a deeper well, a certain amount of drawdown is not going to impact them as much. If they have their pump set deeper, it may not affect them as much. But we're going to be looking to be very conservative because you don't want to be without water. I live on a well. And I can tell you, when the electricity goes out, it's no fun around the house. That's all we have is electricity, and we don't have water. We can't use our restrooms. We can't do anything. So when you're on a well, having water is critical. And people get really upset when they don't have it.
And do you have the data on well and pump depth for those
We
nearby
have
ones?
some data on it. The well records show us how things were constructed in general, but not in detail on all of them. And not every well out there has a well record on it. So when we're doing our research, there may not, you may have a house out there that has no well associated with it. In other cases, you have a well out there that's being run, that's running three homes in a shop, an excavation company.
But that data from what you can find is what you're looking at for, that data from what you can access and what is available is what you're looking at to determine if there will be impacts.
We're looking at that, and we're just looking mainly to go, hey, we better not be doing much here. So we start getting concerned at around 5 feet-ish, 7 feet-ish in that range.
Okay.
It's, you need some of these wells are pretty darn old. And it's like the drillers just went down and tapped, 40 feet into the aquifer and called it good, when they should have kept going. So that's what causes the concern.
What's the distance to the closest well to the
The
mining property?
distance to the closest well,
Curiosity.
the closest well is actually in the property.
Right. I'm thinking, what's the different distance? So the closest residential well is in the property? I'm just wondering, so it's actually on your property? Is that what I'm hearing? That's interesting.
Yeah,
Okay.
that'd be the Yoder well.
Yeah. Okay.
So obviously something's gonna have to be done there, huh?
Right. Yeah. That's fascinating. Okay.
Okay. And with that, I am done, and I'm open to take any additional questions.
This may be a kind of an off question, but you're applying for mineral rights, you're applying for aggregate. The water body is a bonus. Is that owned now by Cadman once that forms?
No, state owns the water.
It does, okay.
State owns my water that I pump out of the grounds, the state owns everybody's water.
Thank you.
So,
Other questions?
Yep.
I don't think so. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Douglas.
appreciate it.
Good evening. Again, that's the end of our presentation, and Andy and I are really here to answer any questions that you may have, or if you want to resurrect, for instance, on the IDP, your question about how to be aware, which is a good one. Because what an inadvertent discovery plan, as it sounds, is, it's a protocol that, depending on the circumstances in the area and whether it's prone to discoveries, it kind of varies. Sometimes we have IDPs where we have full-time tribal monitors, for example, during the entire excavation. Usually it's a large pipeline or something like that. That's probably not feasible here. And in this case, it'll be the removal of the overburden that would be the most likely activity to discover anything. And almost every IDP, in fact, I just Googled one up as I was sitting there, and as I expected, one of the first protocols is to gather together the construction operators. And in the one I was looking at, there's actually a list of what you would expect. The first list are artifacts. The second list is human remains, which is governed by statute. And there's the one I was looking at a minute ago is a list of about 10 types of artifacts that you'd expect an operator to be looking for, not to mention other obvious things like a gravesite. And so one of the first things that typically gets included in an ADP, or an IDP in this case, is the protocols. And the first protocol is before work commences, everybody is gathered together for a training session. The IDP in this case, the reason there's not an express condition requiring it, as I recall, is because there's no inventory sites based on our reconnaissance with the archaeologist. Dagami, as a state agency, has a statutory obligation to coordinate with tribal nations and sovereign entities. So they will send the application for an operating permit, which if the county approves this, the next step is Dagami. They have to issue their own equivalent, more engineering-based operating permit that gets into the details of reclamation and other things. That's where the archaeological piece comes to a fore, because they contact other agencies and circulate the application to ODFW, SHPO, the State Historic Preservation Office. And those other agencies have 35 days to comment. And I guarantee you, the SHPO comment will be, that's an area where there have been artifacts, basically the lower Willamette Valley, and they'll request the IDP. We're just kind of ahead of it and we anticipate it. They're the ones that will review the draft and make sure it's in there. That's a long way of saying if you wanted to put a fine point on that, you could simply, and you were inclined to recommend approval, you would include a recommendation to the board that the IDP include a training session for all operators as they undertake excavation.
I was just curious.
That's kind of the way
if
it
it's already in
works.
there, But thank you, you answered my questions.
And they actually can see small, tiny little artifacts when they're sitting up high in a
Yeah.
big piece of equipment and digging huge quantities. I mean, I guess in reality, my vision of what I think is going to happen in the operation, there's no way if the artifact is 1 inch by 2 inches, you're not going to see that when you're sitting up in a big machine scooping up tons
Yeah.
of aggregate or whatever.
The reason we did the reconnaissance and what an archaeological reconnaissance does, it's not, they don't go out and dig a lot of holes in the first step, it's a phased reconnaissance. And what a trained archaeologist will do, will look at the landform, they'll walk the landform as they did in this case, in its entirety, and they'll look for mounds. They'll look for the features that they know could give rise to a concentration of artifacts. They could look for a village site, for example, but they're really looking for mounds that are obvious burial mounds. If they find those or any indication of that kind of terrain that could give rise to that, they'll go to phase 2. And phase 2 is probes. And because they didn't see any of the first phase evidence in this case, we didn't go to the probe level. On the other hand, I have a site down you can see it from the freeway in Woodburn. And I think the last time I looked, we had 1,200 probes. And we ended up finding the estate of a fellow who in 1830 married, he was a trapper who showed up at Champoy, and he married locally. From all the evidence we found, he carried on a trash heap of some sort from 1830 forward, and we're still finding stuff in that farm field. But it's because we saw the evidence at the surface that gave rise to the next level. So in this case, no, they're probably not going to see an arrowhead. But it's really the process that we have to go through as best we can.
Excellent. Other questions?
Any other questions?
Yeah, I have a question about the BPA tower. Is there a specific criteria that dictates how close you can excavate to that? Is that by
100 feet.
100 feet?
You want me to answer this? BPA isn't new to us because Phase 3 has towers.
I was
in
thinking
their
there
line.
was probably some
So,
in phase 3, yeah.
in Phase 3, and it was before the county at the time in 2012, I think. BPA has well, as you can expect, they're the federal government. You don't really negotiate a lot. You ask them what they need and you turn around and provide it. They have a standard form of land use agreement and they have a standard setback of 100 feet from their towers. And they approved that form in Phase 3, and we just received yesterday their sign off on another agreement that looks exactly like the one for Phase 3 that we'll execute. And there's a condition then that requires that we comply with all the elements of that.
Or is there any conditions as to how deep you can go around that 100-foot radius? Or does it have to be sloped and all that kind of stuff?
2 to 1 side slope.
Okay.
So if we could go 1,000 feet, it'd be a 2 to 1 side slope beginning at 100 feet,
Okay.
which would be a big slide slope.
Yeah, it would be. All right, just curious.
Others?
So for the MAO boundary, can you explain the request for it to be the mining permit boundary rather than as staff was recommending?
Yeah, that's an interesting part of the rule. If you go back to Martha's sequential slides, that's probably number 8 or 9. The thing about the Goal 5 rule is as you see, it's a sequential process, and it's if this, then this, and you get to the end, and you're about at step 8 in the rule. It's actually sub 7 in the rule. And what the administrative rule that LCDC adopted that applies to everybody, you and other counties, says if mining is allowed, the next step in the process by the decision maker, which in this case is the ultimate decision maker, the governing body, the board, is to make a determination on whether the paradigm that we've talked about tonight of minimizing impacts on others as a result of our mining, the paradigm shifts. And now the rule is concerned that counties take into account the possibility of conflicting uses being developed in that 1,500-foot impact area that will threaten the viability of the mining. And the reason that rule evolved the way it did, and it gets to that point at the end of the process, if everybody's decided that mining will be authorized, goes back to Martha's first point, and it was up on her slide. Goal 5 is known by most people as natural resources. Of the 19 planning goals, it's the one that addresses natural resources except for the coastal goals. Wetlands, historic resources, riparian corridors. But buried in the list of 12 resources under Goal 5 are other resources that the legislature in 75, when the goals were adopted, found to be important, and if deemed significant, location, quality, quantity, those resources should be generally protected. In that is geothermal, oil and gas, and aggregate. So in the 12 resources under Goal 5, aggregate is treated at the same level as a wetland if they're both found to be significant. If they're found to be significant, they're put on the county's plan inventory, and once that happens, regulations have to be adopted, as your ordinance does, to protect those resources. That's what gives rise for that step number 8. If mining is allowed, all the analysis that we've been through tonight is concluded. Essentially, the last step that a county has to make is whether to allow, prohibit, or limit new conflicting uses, not those that are today. We're minimizing those impacts. It's the new ones, new conflicting uses in the impact area. And I've done many of these over the years, and I cannot think of one where, as an applicant, we've asked the Board of County Commissioners to go to the next level and limit people's use of their property in ways that otherwise are allowed under the zoning ordinance today, like a dwelling, because of our mining project. There's something inherently complicated about that approach. I've never been involved with an applicant who's asked for that, and we haven't requested it here in this instance. And it's, in my experience, and I've probably done 20 or more of these, the process goes forward. At the last step, a Board of County Commissioners most typically says we're not going to limit conflicting uses, and that's the end of it. And about 3 years ago, in a project that we had, we did exactly that, and the opponents, which surprised me because you wouldn't think this, who appealed it to LUBA, argued that the county was obliged to do the EC analysis that Martha refers to, even if the final decision was to not limit or prohibit conflicting uses. So we got sent back to the county, and we in the county had to do that EC analysis. That's the EC analysis that Martha's thinking about. The short answer to the debate is many counties simply apply the MAO, the overlay zone, or their aggregate base zone just to the applicant's ownership where they're going to be undertaking the extraction and the processing and the stockpiling activity. Clackamas County, in my experience, has for years, and I discovered this and I had to reverse engineer why, the MAO has been expanded in some cases, I think, to the full extent of the 1,500-foot impact area. And in this case, Martha's got an approach that I frankly understand the logic of, which would be to keep the MAO in place and extend it into those areas where if a new dwelling were built, there's a couple little areas, as Martha said, 200 feet, it would create a new dwelling that's not outside of Cary's noise impact boundary. Put another way, that dwelling would be located in an area which Cary's analysis says is going to be subjected to noise levels in violation of the DEQ rule. What the MAO, as I understand it, if applied as Martha's staff report recommends to those areas inside the noise compliance boundary would do is essentially preclude a dwelling. So it would be a finding on the front end, not at the end of the process, that we're going to limit dwellings in the MAO, or I'm sorry, in the area off our site within the noise boundary. And we're fine with that. We're going to have to do that EC analysis, we collectively, if this project is approved, we're going to have to do an EC analysis, and the findings are going to have to be an explanation of what the Board of County Commissioners found and put into their ordinance about what the energy, social, economic, and environmental impacts are of allowing dwellings or not allowing dwellings. It's just the way it is. That's a very long way of saying whether you choose to put the MAO beyond our site boundary, which is totally about 106 acres, 99 excavated, and catch those other, I don't know, 3, 4, 5 acres, whatever it is, within Cary's noise compliance boundary, we're still gonna have to do an EC at the end of the day. You're either gonna decide to limit conflicting uses in that small area within the noise compliance boundary, or you're gonna make a recommendation, if you vote to approve, that conflicting uses shouldn't be limited. And we don't typically do that EC analysis at the recommendation stage. We would do it typically at the board stage, which is where we did the last one. Simply put, we're fine with either boundary, and I don't think you really need that EC before you make a recommendation to the board, because it is, as Martha says, it's kind of an obtuse, in my opinion, balancing back and forth, you know? We're gonna save gas if we don't let somebody put a dwelling out there because they're gonna have to move somewhere else. It becomes a little, it's an odd analysis. My sense is, whichever way you and the staff conclude and how you put that MAO mapping, whether you catch that little area or not, to me, if I were a commissioner, the recommendation I'd probably really like to hear is as much whether you recommend that conflicting uses, dwellings in particular, be precluded if this is approved within that area inside Cary's noise boundary. That's the substantive recommendation that you'd probably want to make. I don't think, and I think Martha probably thinks the same, I don't see a lot of potential for dwellings out there because it's an EFU zone. You're going to have to meet the EFU test. You folks know what that is. It's a high bar. And I just don't see somebody coming in and saying, I want to build my McMansion out here on my 50 feet. That's part of the reason we don't see we don't have a lot of concern and don't feel compelled to go ask that you restrict our neighbors' property rights. But I think the recommendation on whether to limit at all probably is a fair one. That may have muddled it even more, but I think that's where and why it's the debate.
Other questions? So, we have very little public testimony.
Okay.
And the thought went through my head of getting some of these folks out the door. Some people might want to go home, but I recognize that we have been here for 2 hours. Would you like a break, or would you like to push through 10 minutes? I'm seeing we need a break.
Break.
So we'll take a short break. We'll finish up the public testimony and
5
try and
minutes?
Yeah, let's do that.
For your
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thumbs up. There you go, I've got it.
You heard you. That's good.
For those of you who are new to these commissions, I routinely get my hand slapped for either not talking into the microphone or starting the meeting early, so it's become comical at this point. Okay, so thank you all for the presentation. We're going to move into the public testimony really quickly. And so the first step here is to invite any CPOs, hamlets, or villages. I don't think that we have any in the audience. So the next step would be testimony from proponents of the application. I have one person who is neutral. So is there anyone in the public who is a proponent or an opponent who would like to speak tonight? And then finally, we'll move to testimony of persons who are neutral to the application. And I have Mark Trebwesser. Is that how? Thank you. Welcome.
Good evening. My name is Mark Trebwasser. I'm the nursery manager for the warehouse at Aurora Forest Nursery, which is in Clackamas County. The nursery grows seedlings for reforestation for the company, and we also sell to other landowners. Currently, we have about 24 million seedlings in production, and our ability and concern is that in order to grow high-quality seedlings, it requires a lot of water, and there is potential for impact, which we have seen from the mining operations, and so we wanted to make a couple statements. Water is necessary if, if we're growing quality trees, and at different stages, it requires different amount of water. During the growing season, April to July, we use a moderate amount of water, less than most agricultural operations. And August through September, we actually use a minimum amount of water because we're hardening the seedlings off to prevent or prepare them for future summer droughts. So we don't use water very, very infrequently. We're talking 10 to 15 days between irrigations versus every 3 to 4 days. In the fall, September to end of November, water is critical because that is a time when we're protecting the seedlings from frost, and we use water to do that. We actually apply the water to the seedlings, and as long as we get new ice formation, the temperature doesn't drop below 32 or 31, so the trees are protected and not damaged. During that time, we don't have enough water in our wells, and so we actually have to pump water during the daytime when it's above freezing into ponds that we can use at night when the temperature goes below freezing, plus our wells to protect the seedlings. If we get maybe 3 to 5 episodes in the fall, sometimes lasting 2 to 4, 5, 6, 7 days. During that time, we might be pumping from the wells 12 to 22 hours a day for multiple days at a time. So a tremendous amount of water. Losing just 100 gallons would put at risk about 225,000 seedlings. We have the potential for close to, with the wells that we use, if we just said, hey, all of them could be impacted, we could be losing close to 1,000 gallons, which would be 2.5 million trees, or the potential for that. We do know that during phase 3 expansion, one of our wells, which is closest to the current mining operation, did cavitate, and the only explanation for that, because it's been in use for over 40 years, was the mining operation. We had to stop using the well during the summer. We kept it so that we didn't draw down any additional water than was possible to be able to use it just during frost protection. The phase 4 expansion is going to be closer to our operations, and we know that there could be impact in the wells that we own or the wells that we use for land that we lease to grow seedlings on. And we would like to request that all the recommendations in the report, the HGSA report for additional monitoring wells and countermeasures are implemented. But specifically, we would like to request that the southern monitoring wells be installed 1 year before actual mining starts, and that real-time data is monitored and made available to impacted neighbors. In other words, we would like to be able to, if they are monitoring it, that there would be a weekly or a monthly or periodic email with the results, or we have the ability to tie into a site to get that information. We would also like to know what the quantitative triggers are. What are the specific triggers that will be used to make adjustments to mining operations or dewatering that would be allowed? And we would like to request that be put into the stipulations that the neighbors would be notified if the water level drops below 10 feet in any of the southern monitoring wells. And wet mining would be implemented before dewatering lower than the 20 feet below ground level, period. So they cannot draw the water down below the 10 feet. And then finally, the infiltration trench that is proposed as a remedy, if there is some problem, we would like to say that needs to be a best management practice and put into place at the beginning of the operation and not waiting until we have a problem. If we're trying to mitigate something, we're talking about in the period of time in the fall, it's not going to have a lot of impact. And so we're not going to be able to say, oh, yeah, we can put something in and have it immediately impact our wells or beneficially. And so we were saying that needs to be a proactive measure versus a reactive measure. And finally, we'd like just to make sure that it's clear that Cadman is responsible for rebuilding any wells back to their historic levels if there is significant impact. And with that, I'll be glad to answer any questions, or that's all I have to say.
Questions?
I'm just curious, so you said there's kind of a seasonal component to your needs?
A seasonal component, yes.
Yeah,
And the
so-
highest use is usually in the fall, during periods of frost
Yeah,
protection.
when you had the experience with Phase 3, I'm curious what season?
We started having problems. We're saying, hey, we're not getting the pressure we expected, and then we started having surges of water where the well was cavitating. The water level had dropped below the screens.
Yeah,
And we actually had it measured, and it was below the screens. And so therefore, instead of, it's like sucking from a straw that has holes in it,
Yeah.
you get a lot of air.
right.
And you don't get as much.
And so I'm assuming it was at a critical time when this happened?
What was that?
I'm assuming this was at a critical time then when
That was in the summer, so we stopped using the well. And
Okay.
it was such that we could not even use it that fall. And we did not use it all of this summer so that we had it for this fall because of the weather projections for this fall. We knew we were going to need it, so we did not
Okay.
use that well all summer, just to assure that we did not
Okay,
deplete the aquifer any further.
thank you.
And how far is your property and your wells from this property?
5 wells that are probably well within that boundary of influence, and they're less than 500 feet in some cases.
And did you have discussions with the applicant about the failure of that one well, and what was
We
their
have,
response?
and we've had some discussions with Cadman. They've come in, and Doug has come in and presented their information. We have also gone out to our company hydrologist, and some of the information is, they come up with different interpretations. So we just wanted to make sure that our concerns were addressed in any proposal that you sent to the county.
And if some of the steps that you were just suggesting are incorporated into the conditions of approval, would you feel that that mitigates your risk and?
It reduces the
impact?
risk, and
Yeah.
that's what we're concerned with.
Right, okay.
The nursery produces about 40% of all of the trees used on Weyerhaeuser property in Oregon and Washington. And so it's a significant impact. If we
Yeah.
have to cut that in half, then
Right.
where are we going to get the other trees from? Our nurseries can't produce them, and so we would be either have to curtail logging, or they would have to find another nursery. And building a nursery is, a 4 to 5 year period of construction, and finding the site. The Aurora site is ideal. It has some of the best soils, well drained, sandy, easy to work, and produces very high quality seedlings.
Any other questions?
No?
Thank you, Mark, very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Are there any other members of the public who would like to testify? Seeing none, that's great. So with that, we'll move to the applicant's rebuttal. Steve?
Steve Pfeiffer again, and needless to say, we're not, a bit of an unusual situation, but we're not here to rebut what Mark just offered at all.
Sure.
We've actually, as he mentioned, have had some discussions with them, both on the Phase 3 impacts as well as on this application. And frankly, the points that he raises are reasonable. The concerns he raises are reasonable, and the approach that he proposes is the one that we are trying to bring forward as well, which is put as much of the mitigation in play on the front end as we can, which is part of that was the partial dewatering. And remember, Phase 3, if there are issues associated with the fact that Phase 3 has been dewatered completely, Phase 3 will be done at some point, and whatever implications there are from Phase 3 to other wells in the area should be resolved because it will fill back up. So it's really the Phase 4 that poses the problems that Mark and Weyerhaeuser have posed. Those are reasonable requests, and I'm fairly confident that we can work with Weyerhaeuser and come up with, and the staff obviously, with recommended condition language that we can support. What I see is your choice being going forward tonight in light of the concerns that he's mentioned, which again are reasonable ones, and try and craft perhaps some additional conditions yourself. What we can do, or we wait and take time and you resurface again in a month and we come back to you with language. I think our preference would be if you were comfortable moving forward on all other levels, either fashion conditions that address what Mark just testified to tonight, or we're going to work with them and with your staff, and before this goes to the board, come up with language that hopefully will have Mark and Weyerhaeuser in supporting that additional set of conditions, which is what I immediately gravitate to, so.
Helpful. Thank
I
you.
didn't hear anything from Mark that, some of the stuff we're already doing, the BMP with the trench,
Right.
the significance of the triggers. One of you asked the question of how do you define significance of Doug?
Right.
And that brings that right to the fore. And we're gonna have to develop some objective measures and metrics that we don't have right now.
Great. Anything else you would like to add? With that,
One
I
last chance to answer any ask any questions.
I have a question, and I hope I don't, I am going to ask us in an effort to maybe try and save us some time later. And I'm going to go back to this MAO boundary. And I would appreciate, and this may be a question for staff too, having a clear understanding of what criteria we should apply in determining whether to draw that boundary at the property line or within the impacted zone. Does that make any sense? I think if we kind of get some information on this now, it'll make our deliberations go a little more quickly, because I sense that people are struggling with what to do there. Is that helpful?
I can give you our sense. My sense, just from watching and listening and chatting with Martha about it and knowing why Clackamas County has evolved using the MAO as a way to minimize impacts outside the mine boundary. My suggestion is that you leave it the way Martha's staff report recommends it. You know,
And as
which means that the MAO extends into the area that's within Cary's noise boundary, which we could pull up a slide and show, but it's a pretty limited area, as I recall. It's also consistent with my experience of the pattern and practice that Clackamas County's used in the past.
Right.
Which has some merit to it, so.
Am I allowed to talk? If I can jump in, I don't want to muddy it. I guess maybe as an alternative. What?
If
But
you
I'm
don't,
gonna,
I was going
right?
to.
Maybe as an alternative, I'm not sure if I'm going to articulate this correctly. If the easy analysis that has to be done shows that there's no need to limit uses, then there's really no need to have it go past the boundary of the extraction area.
Fair.
But if it shows there is a need to limit uses, then I think maybe it's legitimate to keep it at the impact area.
It's
You
your
follow?
tool for limiting conflicting uses in the impact
Yes.
area.
Yes, it's your tool for limiting exactly. And so if this easy analysis comes back and says there's no need to limit, and quite frankly, there is very limited opportunity on those properties for new uses. They are all high-value farmland. Your state law prohibits a lot of what are considered the conflicting uses, schools, campgrounds, churches, all of those things are actually prohibited on that land. It would really just be residences, which are very limited in EFU, as you all are aware. So I think that we could use the easy as a tool, maybe to delineate that.
Can I ask a question on the
Let's-
consequences, right? So let's hypothetically assume that the easy comes back and shows there's impacts. And then what if we chose not to limit uses? What's the impact of that? Because if we limit uses, right, we're essentially putting an overlay on private property and prohibiting someone from doing whatever they might otherwise want to do with their property. And so if we didn't want to limit that, but there are impacts, what are the consequences and who pays the consequences? Does that make any sense?
What the EC will do is, at a high level, reveal the consequences of limiting conflicting uses to the authorized mine. And it's a two-way street. It's the consequences, energy, social, environmental, and economic, that flow from limiting those uses in that limited area, the future uses in that limited area, and those consequences that flow from not limiting the uses in that area. Let's pick a number. Let's say we conclude there's possibility of 3 dwelling units that could be located there in the future if the county chose not to limit them. You can kind of get a sense of how high level that analysis is going to be. It's literally trying to put, the attempt back in the day was to try and put, to your point, Chair, try and identify the consequences in both directions.
Right.
If we limit somebody's ability to develop noise-sensitive uses within that area, which is within the noise boundary, what are the consequences of that? I mean, I'd have to think a little bit about what that analysis would look like, because I'm not sure what they are. The consequence of limiting that is that somebody would have to build that house somewhere else. That has effects on VMTs, miles. You know, it literally would mean that somebody, the consequences aren't economic to that landowner and why they can't use their land so much, is what are those broad, high-level social, energy, economic, and environmental consequences of limiting or not allowing development to occur in that small area versus what are the consequences of allowing it to occur. It could be done, but I'm not sure it would drive your decision as much as justify your decision.
So real-world circumstance, if we allowed it, somebody built a house
Yeah.
on the edge of the property, they're impacted. Does that mean that your client then needs to increase its mitigation, or does the person building the house just have to deal with the consequences of the mining operation? Does that make,
In theory, if the house was otherwise legally constructed or lawfully constructed, and they could identify and demonstrate that the noise standards were exceeded as a result of the mining operation, and there's nothing that prohibited them from building that house. As you know, some of your own properties may be subject to some of the old easements, that the right to farm easements. There aren't typically right to mine easements. I have an easement on my property that prohibits me from complaining about the Orchard of Spring across the street. In fact, it's just the way it is. I couldn't complain if I wanted to, and I certainly couldn't affect their operations because I've accepted it by accepting that easement. This is one where I think they could probably bring a legitimate claim and make a case that they are being subjected to an impermissible level of noise. And what we would do, we're not going to shut the mine down. We're going to figure out a way, in the same way that Cary has for those other residences that already exist,
Right.
just literally a few 100 feet away, we're going to figure out a way to reduce that noise level to a level that's in compliance. That's what we would do. That's probably one of the easy consequences that we'd have to identify, which is the cost associated with adding new and surprise noise mitigation as a result of a house slipping in over the berm. I mean,
This
that's
particular phase has an ending to it. Right.
that's another part of the.
So could this clause have a sunset? Could we have a sunset clause on this?
Oh, that's an interesting, well, once the MAO is there, it's there until it's removed. So that's a creative thought. If I were a property owner, and I got the MAO stuck on me, and I wanted to build my house right where the MAO showed up, I suppose I would say, well, what happens in 8 years when they're mined out? There's no more noise and it's a lake. Now my house is on the beach. And the answer to that would be, that's an interesting one, Martha. I guess with the MOA still in place, you'd still have the prohibition.
The code suggests that the MAO will be removed by the county after the site's reclaimed.
Really?
Of course, we have yet to actually do that,
Yes.
but the actual mechanism for doing it
Really?
exists in the code, and it could be done.
What type of procedure would that be?
I mean, I guess it's sort of like a reverse zone change, right?
So would it have to go through a type 4 procedure for that,
Historic
or?
landmark overlay.
I can't remember what the code
It's
says,
a zone
but yeah,
change.
it could happen. There'd be a process for that.
Ask that again.
So would it have to be a type 4 procedure, or is it built into the code that once it's gone through reclamation that it can
That I don't remember.
be an
Have to look
easier
at the-
procedure.
I don't know if they'd have to come back through. They wouldn't be doing a plan amendment, so it would just be the
Just the
removing the
overlay.
overlays, so might not have to come back to you.
Yeah, I thought it
How would you
was
know when
a
you-
automatic. As
It
soon
says
as
the
it was
county shall
reclaimed, it was
remove.
out.
So our-
Freeze the
inventory,
reclamation,
too.
Probably.
Our code says when a significant site has been fully mined and reclaimed, and reclamation has been completed, the county shall remove the site from the comprehensive plan inventory and rezone the property to remove the MAO district. The comprehensive plan amendment and zone
automatic,
change
but it's
shall be
mandatory.
initiated by the county or the owner or contract purchaser of the property comprising the extraction area.
That language anticipates a comp plan amendment. It wants it out the inventory too? Mm-hmm. Really?
Bizarre, yes.
And you've never
Neither
done
of us
that?
wrote
never
this
happened.
language.
We've never actually used
Doesn't
it.
allow
We've
for a
never used
lower
it, but
procedure type.
there is
Doesn't
a
say
mechanism
so,
to remove
no.
it, which would also remove the restrictions if there are some.
I mean, it does imply the county could be the applicant, which is normally only the case on a legislative amendment. So I would describe that as slightly bizarre language, and we'd have to
So,
figure it out.
so somebody wants to build a house and they say, no, you can't. And now your 8 years goes by and now they come back to the county and say, okay, they're done. Now can I build my house? Who's going to pay for that reversal? Who's going to do that? Just the county, or would they have to go through an
I
expensive?
mean, in theory, we would have to do it or the mine owner would have to do it.
Okay, but
That's
not
what
the
this says,
person
but
who's gonna
not the
build the house.
person.
Okay,
Correct.
that's what you-
Literally, that's what it says.
So it
But
would
I,
only be the time burden to wait for the overlay to be removed rather than a cost burden.
correct.
And each of your sites, you say you roughly do mine 1 million tons a year, so, and this is an 8 million ton, so it'd be 8 years
Math
roughly.
works, yeah.
Right.
Thanks, Brian.
So just to clarify in my mind one more time, so it sounds like we have three options on that overlay issue, right? It's to leave the overlay at the property boundary. It's to accept the overlay as proposed by staff and prohibit conflicting uses, or accept it, or extend the overlay and, and allow continue conflicting uses, right? We just need to pick one of those three. Is that accurate? Or?
That's kind of my reaction, Chair. I think really your recommendation to the board is probably best to make a decision on whether you conclude, if you vote to approve, whether you believe it would be important to, based on this discussion we
Prohibit or
just
not
had, to
prohibit.
limit
Yeah.
or prohibit the conflicting uses.
Right.
Or to kind of let it go because it's a temporal situation, it's only going to last 5 years or 8 years, it's a small area and all that. The middle ground that I've seen some counties do, which is just adding to the confusion, is you could require that what we call noise-sensitive properties, which in Carrie's world is a place where people spend the night, sleep at night, 24 hours, which is a house, obviously, a hospital. We often have requirements that they increase the noise, they use building materials which reduce the level of interior noise. We have those regulations in Portland when you develop within proximity of the airport, the international airport. You can build out there, but you have to reduce the interior noise level of new construction to a certain level. That's the limit versus prohibit, but my sense of what you probably could do tonight, and the board and staff could work out the details before it gets to the board's final decision, is make the threshold decision of whether it's appropriate to limit new conflicting uses in that impact area within the noise boundary as the staff's original recommendation does. That's kind of a vote. I think you have it right.
Yeah.
That's the fundamental recommendation question that you have to decide. Do we advise the board that based on what we've heard, it would be wise, if this is approved, to reduce potential conflicts for those 8 years by limiting new construction of residences in that area, or not? And an EC analysis later will flow from that decision. It would be adopted in part of the board's ordinance, if they adopted an ordinance to approve.
And you said the timing on that is you'll get the EC, and you'll do the EC analysis in between our recommendation and the board's hearing.
Expect. And it would implement your choice. But as we described, whichever side of that coin you choose, the EC analysis would read much the same because it would simply identify the consequences of one choice or the other.
Right.
It wouldn't drive the choice, it just identifies the implications of the choice.
It's very helpful. Thank you. Anything else for the applicant?
I do have one further question. So our public comment, Mark asked about if the data from the monitoring wells could be made available. Is that something you've done in the past? Is that something that sounds like you could do?
Well, as the hydrogeologist on this, it's not really my call to say whether or not we could give it straight to Weyerhaeuser or not, but we do give the data to Dogami and the county, and it'll be available through those avenues.
How
Thank you.
frequently,
I
how
can-
frequently do you have to give it to Dagami and the county?
We'll be monitoring quarterly.
So do you submit
Yeah.
quarterly
Yeah.
reports, basically?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Correct me if I'm wrong, though, that data provided by the company to Dogami and the county isn't necessarily public record, though, correct? Or like, if a member of the public wanted that information, are they entitled to that?
Characterized.
Right, it's a trade secret or, yeah,
If it's, there's an exception in the public records law for trade secrets and the like,
right.
but it has to be the subject of an express request by whoever provides it, that it be kept confidential, and that request has to be acknowledged by the government when they accept the data. You have to structure it.
Yeah, that's helpful. Okay.
Okay.
Excellent, thank you. Any other questions? Move on to, and do you have anything to add?
I have nothing to add. Thank you.
Thank you. So I think we can move on to staff. Staff have a rebuttal. I think that's next, right? Am I missing that? Applicants rebuttal, yeah. staff.
No, I don't have any rebuttal. I will say that there is a pretty extensive list of proposed conditions that's in section 4, and actually it's probably easier to find on the sheet that was handed to you, which is now Exhibit 6, which includes some amendments proposed by the applicant. And we can certainly make additional amendments to this to reflect what is the most appropriate way to respond. I just am quite frankly not sure what those things would say, so we would definitely need to work on some of the language about the water and the wells. But there are a number of conditions already in here about wells and about replacing wells should they be found to have negatively impacted some neighboring wells, and those are generally, I guess I could put my glasses on. Those are generally conditions 31 through 37 on here. And so it may be that we need to amend those, and we can certainly work with the applicant on some of that language.
And is that possible to work with Cadman as well as Weyerhaeuser?
Yes.
Sort of as a team? Oh,
Yes.
awesome. Because
Yes.
I was kind of curious about the quarterly testing versus maybe what they really need is monthly, because it's so super time sensitive with baby trees. But that's great. That's,
Yeah, I would assume that, that assuming we move forward with this, that we would recommend something along the lines of recommending the conditions of approval, subject to, adding a section around well water that's agreed to by the applicant and members of the public, something like that, and let you guys move forward, yeah. Okay,
So these changes proposed by the applicant, is staff generally in agreement with them? Did staff find any issues with them?
Staff is generally in agreement with them, although condition number 2 really deals with where the boundary is, and so that's something that will change pending what the recommendation is that comes from you all. But the rest of them are mostly clarification. Yeah. And I don't think I have any other comments.
anything else for staff? Okay, with that, I think we can officially close the public hearing and move into deliberations. So.
be following this through
Yeah,
our deliberation.
that's where I was gonna go next. I think, it makes, it may feel a little contrived at some point, but I think, there are, 6 decision-making points that Martha has outlined, and I think that we could literally go through and take a vote on each one, a formal vote, and then that will just move us through the process and lead us to a final decision. Is everyone comfortable with that? So maybe what we do is we just start with a round robin. The first one is obviously, is the site significant, is the application complete?
The first one is the completeness of the application?
Yeah, it essentially combines both, right? So if you look at Martha's spreadsheet, the items above kind of feed into that
You're combining,
next
okay.
question, right? So let's just talk about completeness of the application and significance of the mining area. I won't put anybody on the spot. Any immediate thoughts
I think it was pretty clearly demonstrated.
Yep, agreed.
with that? Anyone have any concerns?
Nope.
So with that,
Good, Michael?
Louise, did you have a question there?
I have a question. Well, if there are conditions that we wish to add, does that impact completeness?
No. The conditions are going to come later on when we discuss whether the impacts of the mine can be mitigated, and that's when the conditions of approval will come in. At this point, it's literally just a matter of, have they provided us all the information that we need to complete their application, and, have they met the criteria of having a significant mining site? So, and that, again, that criteria is basically 2 million tons of material, and I think they've got like 8 million. So with that, would anyone like to make a motion that we determine that the site is significant and the application is complete?
So moved.
So moved by Mary. Is there a second?
Second.
Is there any further discussion? Hearing none, we'll move to a vote. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Anyone opposed? Any abstentions? So motion passes unanimously. So now we will move on to decision point number 2, and that is the question, can all of the conflicts of the mining be minimized? Why don't we just have a quick discussion about that, and we'll figure out how to move forward with a motion. Immediate thoughts?
I think,
I'm sorry, again, we skipping 3 and going to 4?
So
You both, I think, what he's saying.
decision number 2 involves
3 and 4 is what he's
3
saying.
and
We're
4.
trying to get to this.
Okay.
Yeah.
3A, 3B, and 4.
Yeah. So,
I guess my feeling is, I think there's certainly a willingness on the part of the applicant to address any of the potential conflicts that have been brought forward. So in my opinion, they've met the criteria of those 4 areas, in my opinion.
I'd agree.
so I'm not sure if this is the point where we would talk about changing any of those conditions for the well or not.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
Might be under agricultural practices.
I think deciding if conflicts can be minimized is with the conditions, conflicts are minimized. So then the conditions for the wells would need to be discussed here.
I would agree with that, actually. I think now is the point where we have a discussion of whether the conditions are applicable and whether they are suitable. The only thing I think that we might not want to address now is this question of the boundary. We're going to get that at the end, and we understand that the condition would have to be modified. But I think it's fair to have a discussion around whether or not those well water pieces should be pulled into the conditions and how we would want to do that, or if there's anything else that we feel is missing. I think now is the time to talk about
And
that.
noise conditions as
Noise as
well, right, because of right now, there's no set dates on size of the barriers and when they're implemented, so I'd like to see both noise and water. Could we ask that on the water, that they work with Weyerhaeuser and come back with a plan?
Yeah, and that would be my thought. Honestly, I don't think that we need to craft the specifics. I think we've heard from Weyerhaeuser that they have very specific needs, that they're going to have a discussion with staff and the applicant about that. And I think our guidance would be that that should be included in the conditions before, there should be a proposal before it goes to the county commission to address those well water issues.
So my thoughts are on the water issues. are that some of the comments are actually included in the proposed conditions. So for the new 31, those 4 wells shall be monitored quarterly for at least 1 year prior to initiation of the mining. An installation of the 4 monitoring wells is required before initiation of mining. So I think that addressed some of the concerns, and that's already in there. But my biggest concern on the water and the wells is the new condition of approval 37, the additional language of, and the owner of such wells has requested and provided advance access to the applicant for the purpose of establishing a baseline pre-excavation quantity and quality status for the subject well. I think that puts too much of a burden on the surrounding property owners, and I would propose not to include that additional language. And then the other comment for the guidance we give for working out whatever those additional conditions need to be is that they work out some way to determine in the conditions what the significant impact is, some way to determine that, so nearby well owners actually know when they can have recourse for impacts.
And I'm just more concerned about residences and overall water table and aquifer and the impact and the monitoring of that, because the aquifer can be impacted in very long ways, because I know from personal experience, and the whole area's water can be affected if there's too much taken out. So I'm really concerned that we build in conditions about that.
Well, I guess what I was thinking is, it's always nice to say that the affected person has recourse, but ideally you want something that's proactive so you never get to that point. And it seemed like the approach in the presentation on the attention to monitoring the water, the monitoring wells to make sure that they're seeing any kind of activity is a good example of trying to be proactive. So I think that's a good step, but perhaps there's maybe a way to provide some better assurance or collaboration with the potential affected parties so it never gets to a point where they don't have water. And now, how you write proactive language is not, I don't have a good example. It's just something I always practiced with my staff and my projects to make sure, okay, yeah, we may have a legal recourse in place, but that's never fun if it gets to that point. You're much better off to do everything you can to avoid even having the potential conflict. So I'm not sure how you'd word that, but that would be my recommendation, as opposed to just having, well, the owner will be, they'll be taken care of. Meanwhile, they don't have any water, or it turns into a lawsuit, and that's never a good thing. So that's my take. Now, that probably doesn't give you any good, but I think we heard some things tonight that were indicating that the applicant is trying to be proactive and trying to prevent that, and to the extent they can up their game a little bit, that satisfies some of the affected owners, that's what we want to work towards, I think. And if that means maybe a few more wells, or it means more timely reporting to the affected parties, those are things you might want to consider.
Let me try and capture this. So what I heard and what I've heard from you all is, so one, there was a request to establish that southern monitoring well early on at the beginning of the process, which makes some sense. That there's a second need to ensure that there's some sort of standard for disclosure of the well monitoring data to the neighbors. The third would be some sort of qualitative trigger that would occur that would require the implementation of best management practices to maintain water levels. It's kind of what I heard from Mark's testimony. And then the fourth piece there was Mary's recommendation not to include the language in number 37. And I think that captures the core pieces of the well water issue.
What was your second one? I'm taking
The second one that I had was requiring disclosure of the data to the neighbors and having some sort of standard or process for doing that.
Because I think by their very own chart, we have had a lot of drought years. And if you talk to climate scientists, you know that there's more of that ahead. And so there's less rainfall and there's water issues. And so this issue is probably not going to get better, it's going to get worse. In general, water is an issue. So we really need to be proactive about that.
Well, we have dewatering 10 feet below the existing water level. Maybe we should be below the actual surface of the ground. Measure, instead of from the existing ground water level, be measuring from the surface, that we're not going to go below a certain distance from the ground surface. We're going to protect that aquifer no matter what.
I thought it was to the ground
I
surface.
think that's
I
already.
think it is ground
Limited
down
to approximately 10 feet below the existing water level throughout the mining area, or approximately 20 feet below the current ground surface.
Okay.
I think they're doing all the right things to try to be proactive and acknowledge if, this could cause an impact to the neighbors, all right, we gotta stop. But perhaps what's missing is making sure the neighbors are informed better so that they are confident that they're, looking out for their best interests. I think that's maybe what's missing.
So we've talked about water. Are there other impacts that folks are concerned about and questions whether the conditions of approval minimize those or not?
Noise was another
Because
one.
of the fact that they're not firming up about the height of the barriers and when they'll be constructed. It sounded like they were going to get started and, maybe put up a little bit of a barrier and not sure how high and kind of go along as they go along. But noise travels, and just because you're mining in that first cell doesn't mean the noise isn't going to be impacting to the south. In other words, so I'd like to see set dates and heights on the noise barriers.
So condition 48 on the, or I guess it probably should be a new 49, the renumbering didn't continue all the way. On page 6, says the mine operator shall comply with all recommended noise mitigation measures concurrent with mining activities which create the need for such measures. So it sounds like that's what they would have to do, it just doesn't have set dates.
But who
Is that-
enforces that?
Well, I think if a property owner was being impacted, they would point back to these conditions of approval as
Yeah.
not being met. And then ultimately, the government agencies it would either be a county noise ordinance violation, it could be
A
DQ.
violation of this permit,
Yeah,
then we could enforce.
right.
So I think that is sufficient for me. Does that address your concerns, or do you still have concerns?
Yeah, it's a little vague for me, and it's just a little, it puts the, it back on the people who live there to, and maybe they don't want to complain, or maybe they don't even know they can. I don't know how informed they are. They're not here tonight, so I guess I'd like it a little more protective, if you will.
I may be wrong, but my guess is this is not different from the way they build out the previous mining areas. Right, I appreciate that.
I think so.
I hear what you're saying. I also appreciate the mining operation is a moving operation. As soon as they dig up that material, they're gonna start building those berms.
In the other phases, were there equal numbers of residences impacted?
That's what I don't know offhand. I'm
Yeah.
speculating that the previous operations took a very similar course, but I don't know that for certain.
Yeah.
Oh, staff.
May I respond?
I guess,
Yes, that's a common practice in my reading of past applications and conditions of approval. And just to be clear, we can't put dates. It's not feasible to put dates because we don't know when Phase 3 will be mined out. We don't know when they're starting. And I believe the actual volume that they extract is going to be dependent on market conditions, conditions on the ground. I mean, so it's not feasible to put dates, so it has to be worded like that to go along as the area is mined out. But also, the noise study does have clear heights for the boundaries. I think what was causing you some pause is the applicant is not entirely certain yet what it's going to be constructed of, if it's going to be berms or some other barrier or a combination of both. But the heights are set in the noise study. It's just not clear exactly how they will be constructed.
The other thing I would point out is, noise dissipates pretty quickly over distance, right? And so there's a pretty big area buffer on the south side. If they're starting on the north side of the property, by the time that noise gets off their property on the south end, it's going to be much, much quieter and probably meet those noise standards even without the berms. So if they're starting mining on the north side, the buffers on the north side are probably going to be the most important. And as they start to mine out that north end, they'll have materials to be building on the south side to protect noise from coming off the south side of the property.
It looks like the property is only about a quarter mile from north to south and little more than a half a mile from east to west in looking at it and judging by acreage. So that's not a very
Right.
big distance.
So Louise, on the noise mitigation plan in the engineering report, it actually identifies noise levels at residence 4 will remain in compliance with the barrier constructed where shown in figure 6. So, and then it lists that for 4 different sets of residences. So it actually identifies which barriers are in place for which residences for the impacts. So I think it does go into more specifics in the report, in the mitigation measure recommendations, which are adopted by reference in the conditions. So I think there are some more details in there that will address some of that.
Yeah, and I was basing a lot on what the testimony was, which sounded like they weren't really sure yet of the height or what it was, or maybe not the height, or when, but so much of what it was going to be made of. And different barriers have different noise mitigation qualities to them.
I
So-
don't think we're here to make those decisions. We're here to accept the report. The experts have testified as to what the noise levels will be, and we either accept that or we don't. I
Right.
mean, we're not worried about how high it is. They're telling us what's going to stop the noise. So we have to accept that unless you want to
We're here
dispute
to
that.
place conditions that mitigations are done to take care of the noise.
They've already said they're going to take care of the noise.
I think you're just concerned about the timing. I mean, and I think what I'm hearing is ideally you'd like to have all that stuff in place before they start mining, and the reality is they may not have the material to put all that in place at the beginning without having to bring it in or excavate areas. So they're trying to do it in a more practical approach and recognizing as they're working this area, okay, here's the noise implications from this area, so we'll make sure those berms are installed and so on. And then as we move, then we'll address those as we move forward. So it could be years before some of those noise issues would even be an issue for
Right,
the
and
neighbors.
I see that, but I'd
Yeah.
like it, like the first one and the second one, in other words, always be one ahead, be one step proactive ahead of the game.
Anyway.
Are we ready for a
I'm not
motion?
concerned. I think it'll be okay.
Yeah, I'll do my best.
Go, Mary.
Let me see. So I would move that we say that all conflicts can be minimized with the conditions of approval, with a few updates, including removing the proposed changes to condition of approval newly numbered 37, that puts the burden on the residents nearby. That there is some guidance worked out on what significant impacts to those nearby wells would mean, preferably with quantitative and qualitative triggers. That there's some form of collaboration established for the mining operations with affected or potentially affected well owners nearby. That the south monitoring wells are put in place at least 1 year prior to mining activities beginning, and that there's some sort of data disclosure or access worked out for the neighbors with potentially affected wells.
And just for clarification, when you say conditions of approval, you're referring to the conditions as marked up and amended by the applicant.
In Exhibit 6, yes.
And I second that motion.
A motion by Mary, second by Tammy. Any further discussion? Seeing none, I think we're ready to vote. All those in favor say aye.
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 Anyone opposed?
I'll be a nay.
One negative, nay. Any abstentions? So motion carries. All right, so with that, I believe that we can move on to the third decision point. Someone might have to help me with this.
We did.
To be
We don't
clear,
need
the-
to get to the third decision point because we've decided that the impacts can be mitigated. So with that, we will move to decision number 4,
Yes.
correct? And so that is the reclamation plan acceptable?
I think that's a determination of Dagami, and that's in the conditions, so I'm satisfied with that.
Is that a motion?
Yeah.
Would you like to form that as a motion? Then we can discuss it.
Let's see, decision number 4. Yes, I would move that the reclamation plan as conditioned by Dagami approval is acceptable.
I'll second.
Second, discussion. Y'all are quiet. You ready to vote?
I mean, we don't
Yes.
really have a lot to say on it anyway, it's all up to Dagami, so.
So with that, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Anyone opposed? Any abstentions? Motion carries. See, this process that Martha laid out is helping a lot. All right, so I think at this point, we can get to maybe the
Future conflicting use.
hardest part of the evening. Actually, no.
Great, that's what it's about, isn't it?
Yeah, so we've made the decision to allow mining, and now we are literally moving to the discussion of where ultimately we need the discussion around where that boundary gets drawn.
Correct.
So let's just have a quick discussion about that. We'll figure out where to move forward. I have my thoughts.
And
but-
was the discussion not that really what is going to happen is the EZ report will drive that out versus, is that a decision we're making this evening? I'm a little confused.
I think it sounds like we make a recommendation on what the best course is for
Oh.
where the MAO boundary is, and then the EC analysis will basically just say the consequences either way.
I see.
So we know what the consequences will be, or the board will know what the consequences will be.
Perfect. That helps. Thanks, Mary.
I'm trying to get my head around, is there really a difference between putting the boundary or the overlay at the boundary of the property and then there's the other option is to have the overlay extend past the boundary and not prohibit uses? It's basically the same thing, right? Because either way, if someone builds next to the property in that scenario, they potentially have a claim against the applicant.
If the MAO is the impact area, then they can't build in it. If the MAO is the property line, then they could, and it could potentially be an impact on the mining operations, and they'd have to do further noise mitigations.
Yes, that's how I understood it. So we either say, if somebody chooses to build and can, they make their money and they can do it on EFU land, then it can potentially be the mining operations problem. But if they just can't build until it's no longer an MAO, then they can't build till it's MAO, and the county releases it, and then they can build. So, it's a tough one.
For me, it seems like there might be more burdensome process later on if we do the boundary to include the neighboring properties in the impact area. Because then it's any future for possible residences or whatever it is, growth there, development there, is dependent upon waiting for that MAO to be removed, even if the mining operation has been completed. So it might cause more headaches if it's outside than if it's at the boundary. And the risk is to the applicant if it's at the property line rather than the boundary because they might be liable to do more mitigation measures, and they said that's how they normally do it, and they're willing
Right?
to accept
Fix it
that.
and go on.
But yeah, I mean, I think they're actually two different decisions, right? Where you put the overlay determines the scope of the easy analysis. But if the overlay exists, just because the overlay is there doesn't mean you have to allow or prohibit. That is our decision to make based on the easy analysis, right? So
No, I
where
think
the
it's-
overlay is has no bearing on whether or not additional dwellings are allowed. That's a separate decision-making point. Am I right on that? Or-
You can allow uses in the overlay. The difference between having a use allowed in the overlay versus just having the line on the boundary and everything's allowed
Is where you're gonna measure the
is
impact.
that if you're proposing development in the overlay, you have to go through additional permitting subject to section 708. Even if it's an allowed use, there's still additional permitting that's required related to dust and noise, and Jennifer has it, I don't have the exact language. So you are basically, where is it? Oh. So even if it's an allowed use, you would still have to address things like the proposed use will not cause a mining operation that is otherwise lawfully operating to violate any applicable standards and things like that. And so it puts an extra permitting step on you. And you would be, if you were building a house, you would have to demonstrate that building your house is not going to cause the mining operation to then be in violation of the DEQ noise standards. It's sort of like backwards.
So in other words, it puts the onus on whoever's building
Yes,
comply as opposed to the applicant. And
Yes.
that's the intent of why you.
yes. If you allow it, you could just decide to prohibit it, then someone couldn't even come in and to try to get a permit.
So I have another question though. What's the likelihood, because of already the way the areas are zoned, that you could have
Very small.
a conflict in the next 8 years?
I would say it's very small. It's zoned EFU. Several of the parcels already have a dwelling on it.
Yeah.
In theory, they could do a replacement dwelling and decide they want to be right next to the mining operation, I suppose. It costs money to build a new house. I don't know how likely it is that somebody would do that. I believe there's only one parcel that's zoned EFU there that's vacant, and it would need to qualify under a land use approval based on income generated by the farm.
So the purpose of the overlay is to protect the mining resource, right?
Yes.
And so we've got an applicant who has essentially said, we've never before had any concern about limiting the neighbor's access. I don't think they're concerned per se about their resource. There is a potential that someday if that overlay is built to the line, somebody could build up next to their property, and then they would have to deal with that neighbor in terms of mitigating noise pollution or other impacts, right? And it strikes me that would be the cleanest way to do this, is to say that the boundary should be at the border of the property, and the applicant then would have to accept the risk that at some point there might be development on the adjoining property that might impact their operation, and they're not going to be protected by this county overlay to deal with that. They would just have to address those issues
Just
with the.
mitigate.
Right.
Yeah, because there are sound mitigations.
Right.
They could do within the building structure itself.
The alternative to that would be to put the overlay on and prohibit those uses, but then we're basically limiting the private use of property as a result of this. And I'm not sure that that's needed, especially given the way this mine is going to be built out.
Or what Merv's saying is you don't stop them from building, but you tack on that
Right.
you need to understand you're next to a mine and you need to be utilizing resources or materials in your building that would mitigate sound.
But can you do that?
Complicated.
Yeah, that would be very complicated because you
But you
still
have
get
to-
the sound when
I
you're
don't think we
outside.
could do that unless we
Was
have the
within a
overlay.
boundary. Yeah, we'd
Yeah.
have to have an
Uh,
overlay
We would have to extend the
That,
overlay out.
it seems to me,
condition.
I guess I'm kind of the opinion that it's in the best interest of the applicant to do this, perhaps. But on the other hand, the risk is low that it's really going to be an issue. And that this is a temporary situation, so that to put that on there and then have to remember at some point in time to, oh, yeah, we got to take this off now.
Right.
I'm inclined to take the risk personally, but I mean, I also understand the logic of having the boundaries.
Are we lowering a property value in EFU by putting a boundary out there?
I
also?
think
Is that-
that's it. I think if you put that overlay out there, you are probably reducing someone's property value, potentially limiting the amount of development that could occur.
It's another
And that's my
restriction
cons-
at
yeah.
a sale of property, so.
Yeah,
Yeah.
right.
I think all of that would be looked at in the EC analysis too. So I think I'm also inclined to say it's probably just simpler to leave it at the mining permit boundary for the applicant's requested changes on this, but maybe say something subject to the findings of the EC analysis.
Is that a
I'm with
motion?
you. Yes, yes, I second that
Would you
motion.
like it to be, okay,
Try to get out of here.
so where are we at? Does the EC analysis need to be completed for future uses within the impact area? Okay, I
We're on
would
8.
move that, on the Exhibit 6, condition of approval number 2, we accept the applicant's changes for mining permit boundary to be the MAO boundary, but also add subject to findings of the applicable EC analysis. And that is the additional EC analysis for decision number 5.
I second that motion.
Motion by Mary, seconded by Tammy. Any further discussion?
Nope.
Let me see if, tell me what we're deciding on here. What does the motion say again?
Repeat it?
That the MAO boundary is at the property line,
Okay,
and that's subject to the findings of the applicable EC analysis.
okay, so whether it's voted up or down, does that make the mining operation not go?
No, there's
No.
nothing to affect with
Okay,
it.
so
it's
the
just-
mining operation is gonna go.
Already approved
We're just deciding where the boundary's gonna be.
Correct,
Right.
correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Anyone opposed? Any abstentions? Motion passes. Is there anything else that staff needs from us from a decision-making standpoint on this? On this whole thing?
I think we're done, aren't we?
Do we need the official motions to approve the 4 applications or the 3
We need,
applications?
yes, we do. The application, number 407, you need to approve the Mao District Site Plan Review, which is basically the analysis against ZDO Section 708 and the operations of the mining plan, because you can have the significant site, you can have the Mao boundary. This actually authorizes them to start mining.
Right. Okay.
So do we need the official motion for all 4 of the proposals, basically?
Once, yeah.
You can do it all at once,
Okay.
if you can figure out how to word it, Mary.
You're pretty good at it.
Yeah, Mary.
Excited to put that on me, huh?
There's a reason
you're on Okay.
this commission.
Do you have this, where's my staff report?
We have discovered your role, for sure.
Oh, great.
Do we have to make reference then
Okay.
also to what we just
Yes, you can,
approved? Somehow do you have to make reference to that when you approve those? Or not, do you know?
yes,
Okay.
I will. Catch me if I don't.
No,
Okay.
Just clarifying.
I would move that we approve the PAPA application file number ZO406-19CP. We approve the mineral aggregate overlay file number ZO408-ZAP. We approve the site plan review file number ZO407-19-MAO, and we approve the modification of conditions of approval in planning files number ZO348-93-CP, ZO349-93Z, and Z1826-97-MAR, subject to the conditions of approval in Exhibit 6 with the applicant's changes and those changes as noted for our previous motions tonight.
Whoa.
She's good, she is
I
good.
second it.
Motion by Mary, second by Louise. Did you get all that?
Challenging me tonight.
It's on a recording.
Yeah, I was looking at you. I was
What
like,
it's
"You
worth,
getting all
it's on
that?"
Martha's slide here. Yeah.
Copy and
Okay.
paste the recommendation from the staff report and add what the other ones were.
I got it. And then Louise.
Second.
Does everyone understand the motion?
Yep.
Any further discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Anyone opposed? Any abstentions? Motion carries. Now I think you've got everything you need, right? Excellent.
Great.
All right, so we will wrap up very quickly. Is there a schedule review that we need to do?
I'd just like to comment
So we had
on,
held
if I
January
could,
13th if this needed to be continued. Since it doesn't need to be continued, our plan is to finish the study session that Glenn started last week on January 13th. And then we will we will present our white paper on the Housing Strategies Project on January 27th. So you will in fact have 2 meetings in January.
Excellent.
I just want to compliment both the applicant and Martha
Yes.
for a really nicely
good job.
done
Yeah.
application and staff report.
Yep.
Very well done.
Martha, do we just leave all this for you?
Oh, thank you. Yes. If
Thank
you
you.
haven't marked up your binder, I would like to,
Oh.
Yeah,
well,
you're welcome
even if
to.
you have, you can leave it with me.
Okay.
But if you haven't marked up your binder, will you let me know? I'm going to send a copy or 2 over to the board.
Marked.
If you have, it's okay.
I have not marked mine.
I'll take Tom's.
I wasn't planning on taking it home, so I'm glad you're taking it.
Yep, leave 'em here.
We are going to officially adjourn. Cameraman. Thank you.